This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was never one to believe in the paranormal. Ghost stories, hauntings, spirits. It all seemed like nonsense to me. That is, until that day in the old Victorian house my girlfriend and I were renting. We'd moved in about a month earlier, drawn to the charm and character of the place despite its creaky floorboards and drafty windows. Built in the late 1800s, it had that classic Victorian architecture. Ornate woodwork, high ceilings, a grand staircase. It needed some work, but we loved it. That afternoon started like any other. It was a lazy Sunday and we were just lounging around the house. I was sprawled on the couch reading a book while my girlfriend Emma puttered around in the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I remember glancing up from my book and letting my eyes wander around the living room. They settled on the tall bookshelf against the far wall, filled with our eclectic collection of novels, textbooks, and knickknacks. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then it happened. 1 second the shelf was still, the next there was movement. My eyes widened as I saw a book, an old leather-bound Bible that had come with the house, slide out from its spot on the middle shelf. But it didn't just fall, it flew. The Bible shot out from the shelf, as if it had been yanked by an invisible hand. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc, clearing a good 5 feet before clattering to the hardwood floor with a loud thump. I sat there frozen, my own book forgotten in my lap. Did that really just happen? I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Books don't just fly off shelves on their own. It defied all logic and reason. "Emma!" I called out, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Did you see that?" She came hurrying in from the kitchen. "See what? What happened?" I pointed to the Bible lying on the floor. "That book, it just flew off the shelf, by itself." Emma looked from me to the fallen book and back again, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean it flew? Books don't fly, Jake." "I know that," I said, getting to my feet. "But I swear I watched it happen. It came off the shelf and sailed through the air. Look how far it is from the bookcase." We both stared at the Bible. It was a good 5 feet from the shelf, much too far to have simply fallen. Emma walked over and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "Are you sure you didn't just, I don't know, forget that you threw it earlier or something?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way. I was sitting right here reading. It happened just now. I saw it with my own eyes." She gave me a skeptical look, but I could tell she was unsettled. We both were. How do you explain something like that? We spent the next hour examining every inch of that bookshelf and the surrounding area, looking for any possible explanation. Maybe there was a wire or string we couldn't see, or the floor was uneven, causing things to roll. But we found nothing. I replayed the incident over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, or there was some logical explanation I was missing. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. We were both on edge for the rest of the day, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. But nothing else unusual happened, and we eventually tried to put it out of our minds. Just a weird fluke, we told ourselves. I almost had myself convinced it was nothing by the time we went to bed that night. Almost. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thud from downstairs. Emma stirred beside me. "What was that?" she mumbled sleepily. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The house was dead silent. "I don't know," I whispered. "I'm going to go check it out." "Be careful," Emma said, fully awake now and clutching my arm. I crept down the stairs, flicking on lights as I went. Everything seemed normal in the living room until I saw it. The Bible was on the floor again, in the exact same spot as before. My blood ran cold as I stared at it. This couldn't be happening. Forcing myself to move, I walked over and picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was cool to the touch, completely ordinary. But how it got there was anything but ordinary. I don't know how long I stood there holding that book, my mind racing. Eventually, Emma's voice calling down the stairs snapped me out of it. "Jake, is everything okay?" I quickly put the Bible back on the shelf. "Yeah," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything's fine, just a book that fell, coming back up now." I didn't tell her what I'd found. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Hell, I felt crazy. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake until dawn, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, half expecting to see that Bible come flying in at any moment. The next few days passed without incident, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. There was a tension, a feeling of being watched. I found myself avoiding the living room, steering clear of that bookshelf. Emma could tell something was bothering me. "Are you still freaked out about that book?" she asked one evening. "I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Old houses settle. Maybe it just fell in a weird way." I wanted to believe her, but I knew what I'd seen. Twice now. It was about a week later when it happened again. This time, we both saw it. We were having dinner in the living room, some silly reality show on TV in the background. I was mid-bite when movement caught my eye. The Bible slid out from the shelf, hovered for a split second, then launched across the room. It hit the far wall with a loud smack before falling to the floor. Emma's fork clattered to her plate. We stared at each other, then at the book, then back at each other. There was no denying it this time. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, her face pale. How is that possible?" I shook my head at a loss for words. We approached the fallen book cautiously, as if it might suddenly spring to life again. "We need to figure this out," I said, my mind racing. "There has to be an explanation." We spent hours that night experimenting. We checked for hidden wires, magnetic fields, air currents from vents, anything that could possibly cause a book to move like that. We even set up Emma's old laptop to record the shelf, hoping to catch any further incidents on video. But the Bible remained stubbornly in place. No amount of prodding or testing could recreate what we'd seen. Days turned into weeks. We grew jumpy, always watching that bookshelf out of the corner of our eyes. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure I'd heard a thud from downstairs. But every time I checked, the Bible was in its place. We debated telling someone, friends, family, maybe even a paranormal investigator. But who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. The flying Bible incidents stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when you've witnessed the impossible. We still live in that old Victorian house. The Bible sits on its shelf, seemingly harmless. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and still, I swear I can feel it watching me, waiting. I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened during those strange weeks. Was it some kind of localized paranormal activity, a bizarre series of coincidences, or something else entirely? All I know is that it changed me. I used to scoff at ghost stories and tales of the unexplained. Now I'm not so sure, because sometimes the impossible happens, and when it does, it shakes your world to its very foundation. So if you're ever in an old house and see a book move on its own, don't ignore it. Don't try to explain it away, because trust me, once you've seen it, you can never unsee it, and you'll never look at the world quite the same way again. I was just a kid when my family was stationed in Wiesbaden, Germany in the mid-90s. My dad was an army officer and we'd moved around a lot. But this was our first time living overseas. At first, I was excited. A new country, a new adventure. But looking back now, I wish we'd never set foot in that house. It started small. Little things that were easy to brush off. Objects not quite where we'd left them. Cold spots in certain rooms. The occasional creak or thump that seemed to come from nowhere. My mom joked that the house was just settling in to us being there. If only we'd known. I shared a room with my younger brother Tommy. He was only 5 at the time, still clutching his stuffed bear every night. I remember the first time he woke me up in tears, saying there was a shadow man standing at the foot of his bed. I told him it was just a bad dream and to go back to sleep. God, I wish I'd believed him. A few nights later I saw it too. I jolted awake in the middle of the night for no reason. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I made out a hooded figure looming over Tommy's bed. It was like staring at a black hole, not just dark, but an absolute absence of light. And the hatred, I'd never felt anything like it. Pure malevolence radiating off this thing in waves. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to even call out. After what felt like hours, it simply faded away. I convinced myself it was just a dream, a trick of shadows and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. Things only got worse from there. One afternoon, I was home alone doing homework when I heard Tommy's stuffed bear start talking from the other room. Not just garbled nonsense either. It was reciting the Lord's Prayer in a low, guttural voice. I ran in and found the bear sitting upright on Tommy's bed, its mouth moving in perfect sync with the words. When I grabbed it, the voice cut off mid-sentence. I stuffed that bear in the closet and never told anyone what happened. The activity in the kitchen was near constant. Cabinets would slam shut on their own. Dishes would rattle in the sink. Once, every faucet in the house turned on simultaneously. Full blast. The water was pitch black and smelled like sulfur. My parents tried to downplay everything at first. They didn't want us to be scared. But I could see the worry in their eyes, the way they'd exchange glances when something weird happened. It all came to a head the night my dad saw the hooded figure. He'd been working late, coming home well after midnight. Mom was asleep, but Tommy and I were huddled in my bed. Neither of us wanted to sleep alone anymore. We heard the front door open, then heavy footsteps on the stairs, but they stopped abruptly halfway up. After a long moment of silence, we heard Dad let out a strangled yell. There was a crash, then the sound of him scrambling up the rest of the stairs. He burst into our room, white as a sheet and breathing hard. "Did you see it?" he demanded. "The man in the black robe?" We nodded, and I'll never forget the look of absolute terror on my father's face. This was a decorated army officer, a man I'd always seen as fearless. But in that moment, he looked like a frightened child. From that night on, the paranormal activity intensified tenfold. It was like whatever was in that house knew we were all aware of it now, and it wanted to make its presence known. Objects would fly across rooms. Horrible, pained screams would echo through the halls at all hours. We'd wake up with deep scratches on our bodies. Tommy stopped speaking entirely, retreating into himself. The worst was the attic. We never went up there. It had been locked and boarded up when we moved in. But sometimes, late at night, we'd hear heavy footsteps pacing back and forth overhead, dragging sounds, like something being pulled across the floor. And once, just once, I swear I heard a child crying up there. My parents contacted the base housing office begging to be moved, but with so many families stationed there simply weren't any other houses available. We were trapped. It all came to a head one night in early December. A blizzard was raging outside, and the power had gone out. We were huddled in the living room, a few candles providing meager light. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. Suddenly, every door in the house slammed shut simultaneously. The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath misting in front of me. And then, emerging from the shadows, was the hooded figure. But this time, it wasn't alone. A procession of dark shapes materialized behind it. Some were human-like, others twisted and deformed. They began to circle us, moving in perfect unison. The hatred emanating from them was overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning in it. My dad tried to stand up, to confront them, but he was thrown back by an invisible force. Mom was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. Tommy had curled into a ball, rocking back and forth and muttering to himself. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, we heard it, a deafening crack from above, like the house itself was splitting in two. Plaster rained down as a jagged fissure opened up in the ceiling, and peering down at us from the darkness of the attic was a face. Dear God, that face. Pale, corpse-like skin stretched tight over an elongated skull, empty black sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth full of rows upon rows of needle-like teeth. I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember is waking up in the base hospital. They told us there had been a gas leak in the house, that we were lucky to be alive. But we knew the truth. We left Germany as soon as my dad could arrange a transfer. We've never spoken about what happened in that house, but the memories haunt us to this day. Sometimes I wonder about the family that moved in after us, if they experienced the same terror. Part of me hopes the evil in that place was tied to us somehow, that it didn't torment anyone else. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was in that house in Wiesbaden is still there, waiting. And God help anyone who walks through that door. It all started about a week after I moved in. I was still getting used to the quiet nights, the vastness of the desert surrounding me. The house was modern, spacious, with large windows that offered panoramic views of the barren landscape. My bedroom was my favorite part, a large, airy space with an ensuite bathroom and a walk-in closet. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from unpacking the last of my boxes. I remember drifting off to sleep, feeling content in my new home. But sometime in the early hours, I jolted awake. You know that feeling when you're being watched? That's exactly what I felt. My heart was racing, and I had this overwhelming sense of dread. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my eyes darting around the darkened room. And that's when I saw them, two glowing red eyes, staring at me from the partially open closet door. I blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But when I opened my eyes, they were still there, unblinking, fixed on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like hours, lying there, locked in a staring contest with whatever was in my closet. Eventually, as the first light of dawn started to creep in through the windows, the eyes vanished. When morning came, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a vivid dream, or my eyes playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar darkness. I spent the day trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, keeping myself busy with work and more unpacking. But as night fell again, the dread returned. I didn't want to go to my bedroom, but I couldn't sleep on the couch forever. I decided to leave all the lights on, thinking that might help. It didn't. As I lay in bed, wide awake and on high alert, I felt it again, that oppressive presence. This time, I didn't see the eyes, but I could feel something in the room with me. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. The closet door was closed, but I swear I could hear something moving inside, a soft rustling sound that made my skin crawl. This went on for several nights. I wasn't sleeping, I was jumpy during the day, and I was seriously considering moving out. But a part of me was angry. This was my house, my fresh start. Whatever this thing was, it had no right to be here. On the 5th night, something in me snapped. As I felt that now familiar presence fill the room, I sat up in bed and shouted, "Get out! This is my home and you're not welcome here." My voice sounded braver than I felt, echoing in the quiet room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the closet door began to open. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. A dark, shadowy figure emerged from the closet. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form shifting and wavering like smoke. There were no distinct features, just a mass of darkness darker than the night around it. The figure moved, gliding across the room towards the bathroom. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it passed by my bed. It didn't turn to look at me, just kept moving in that unnatural floating way. As it reached the bathroom door, it simply vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, like someone had flipped a switch. I sat there in shocked silence for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even blink in case it came back. But it didn't. As the sun began to rise, I felt something change in the atmosphere of the room. The oppressive feeling that had been my constant companion for the past few days was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. In the days that followed, I waited nervously for the entity to return, but it never did. The closet remained just a closet, the bathroom just a bathroom. No more glowing eyes, no more shadowy figures. It was as if my confrontation had somehow banished it. I've tried to find logical explanations for what happened. Maybe it was stress from the move, maybe some kind of desert fever or hallucination brought on by the change in environment. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I felt. It was real as the desert outside my window. I still live in that house. I've made it my home, filled it with light and life. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I find myself glancing at the closet door, half expecting to see those glowing red eyes again. They never appear, but the memory of those terrifying nights remains etched in my mind. I don't know what that entity was, or why it was here. Was it some kind of desert spirit, disturbed when they built this house? A remnant of something that happened on this land long ago? Or something else entirely, something beyond our understanding? I'll probably never know. What I do know is this: sometimes the most effective weapon against the unknown is our own voice, our own will. Standing up to that shadow, claiming my space, seemed to be what finally drove it away. It's a lesson I'll never forget, a reminder of the strength we all have inside us, even in the face of inexplicable terror. So if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, facing something you can't explain, something that terrifies you to your core, remember this: your voice, your will, your very essence as a living, breathing human being can be more powerful than any darkness. Stand your ground, claim your space, and hope that, like mine did, the shadows retreat, leaving you in peace. I had just moved into my new apartment and was feeling pretty excited about the change. It was my first time living on my own, away from my family, and I was looking forward to the independence. The apartment wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom place in an older building downtown. But it was mine, and that's what mattered. The first few days were pretty uneventful as I unpacked and got settled in. I kept expecting to feel creeped out or notice something weird, given that it was an old building. You always hear stories about haunted apartments, right? But nothing out of the ordinary happened. If anything, I was a little disappointed. Part of me had been hoping for at least a creaky floorboard or two. It wasn't until about a week after moving in that I started to notice little things here and there. At first, it was just glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. I'd be sitting on the couch watching TV and swear I saw something dart past the doorway to the kitchen. But when I'd look, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me. Then the noises started. Little taps and creaks that seemed to come from inside the walls. Again, nothing too weird for an old building, but it was enough to make me take notice. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door when I knew none of my neighbors were home. The sound of doors closing when I was alone in the apartment. I tried to rationalize it all away. My imagination was just running wild in a new place. The building was old and settling. The neighbors were probably just quieter than I realized. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. Things escalated about 2 weeks after I moved in. My mom and brother had come over to help me hang some shelves and pictures. We were all in the living room, taking a break and chatting. I got up to grab some drinks from the kitchen, and as I walked past the open door to my bedroom, I froze. There, plain as day, I saw a figure that looked exactly like my brother walking across my room. But my actual brother was still sitting on the couch, visible through the doorway. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. When I looked again, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding as I stumbled back to the living room. I must have looked pale because my mom asked if I was feeling all right. I mumbled something about being dehydrated and quickly changed the subject. How could I even begin to explain what I'd just seen? That night, after my family had left, I lay awake in bed for hours, unable to shake the image of my brother's doppelganger from my mind. Every creak and groan of the building made me flinch. I kept expecting to see that figure again, standing at the foot of my bed or lurking in a doorway, but the night passed without incident. The next day, I was sitting at my desk trying to get some work done when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the wall next to me. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. A few seconds passed in silence, and then knock, knock, knock. There it was again. My palms were sweating as I slowly turned to face the wall. Hello, I called out hesitantly. Nothing. Then, after a moment, knock, knock. A chill ran down my spine. Was something responding to me? With a shaking hand, I knocked twice on my desk. 2 answering knocks came from the wall almost immediately. My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. And yet, I had to know more. If you can understand me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Knock once for yes and twice for no. A single firm knock resonated through the wall. I let out a shaky breath. Are you human? 2 knocks. My heart was racing. Are you dangerous? A long pause. Then 2 slow, deliberate knocks. I slumped back in my chair, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Whatever this was, it claimed not to be a threat. But could I trust it? Do you live here, in the apartment? I asked, One knock. Have you been here a long time? One knock. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the next question. Were you the one I saw in my bedroom yesterday, the figure that looked like my brother? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, one soft knock. I felt the blood drain from my face. It hadn't been my imagination. Something was really here, in my apartment, something that could take on the appearance of people I knew. "Why?" I whispered. "Why are you here? Why are you showing yourself to me?" But there were no more knocks. No matter how many questions I asked or how I pleaded, the presence remained silent. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every little sound. That night I barely slept, convinced I would open my eyes to find some otherworldly figure standing over me. But nothing happened. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I kept expecting more knocks, more apparitions, but there was nothing, just the occasional creak or shadow that could easily be explained away. Had I imagined it all? A week went by, then two. No more ghostly figures, no more mysterious knocking. I started to relax, to convince myself it had all been in my head. Maybe I'd been more stressed about the move than I'd realized. Maybe I'd had some kind of waking dream or hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. I was just starting to feel normal again when it happened. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I felt it, a presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, I turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure that looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same clothes. But its face was blank, featureless, like someone had taken an eraser to where the eyes, nose, and mouth should be. I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the counter hard. A plate slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, heedless of the broken ceramic around me. What was happening? What did it want from me? As I sat there, shaking and trying to catch my breath, I heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder. Knock, knock, knock. Coming from every wall, every surface. The counter, the cabinets, the floor, the ceiling. A cacophony of knocking that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken dishes and the echoes of impossible knocks. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to clean up the mess and stumble to bed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? How could I possibly stay here, knowing what I knew? But how could I leave? Who would believe me if I tried to explain? As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I made a decision. I would stay. I would face whatever this was head on. If it wanted to communicate, fine. We would communicate. If it wanted to scare me, I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. This was my home now, damn it. And I wasn't going to be chased out by knocks and shadows. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a terrifying question. What if it doesn't want me to leave? I've been here for 3 months now. The knocking comes and goes. Sometimes I see things, flashes of movement, familiar faces where they shouldn't be. But nothing as dramatic as that night in the kitchen. I've learned to live with it, this presence that shares my space. We've come to an understanding of sorts. It doesn't try to terrify me, and I don't try to exorcise it or move out. But every night as I'm falling asleep, I wonder, is this really my apartment? Or am I just a guest in someone else's home? And what happens when they decide they no longer want to share? I was never one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, paranormal encounters, all that stuff. I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations or people looking for attention. But after what happened in that house, I'm not so sure anymore. It's been months, and I still can't make sense of it. It all started when my best friend Jake inherited an old Victorian house from his eccentric great-aunt. She had been a collector of all sorts of antiques and curiosities, and the place was packed full of weird old objects. Jake asked me to help him sort through everything and get the house ready to sell. At first, it was kind of fun, like being in a bizarre museum. We found everything from creepy porcelain dolls to dusty old books in languages we couldn't identify. But the prize of the collection was this ornate carving set, a matching knife, fork, and serving spoon made of tarnished silver with intricate engravings all over the handles. Jake's aunt had kept it displayed in a glass case in the dining room. "Man, this thing must be worth a fortune," Jake said, carefully examining the knife. "Maybe we should get it appraised before we sell anything." I nodded in agreement. "Yeah, definitely. Let's set it aside for now." We spent the next few days going through the house room by room, boxing up what we could donate or sell. It was tedious work, and we were both getting pretty worn out. By the end of the week, we had made decent progress, but there was still a ton left to do. That Friday night, we decided to order some pizza and crash at the house instead of driving back to the city. We were sitting in the living room, stuffing our faces and joking around, when suddenly Jake got really quiet and his eyes went wide. "Dude, what's wrong?" I asked. He was staring past me towards the front entryway. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it. The fork from the carving set was standing straight up on the floor, its tines pointed directly at the front door. A chill ran down my spine. "What the hell?" I muttered. "Did you put that there?" Jake shook his head. "No way, man. I haven't even touched that set since we looked at it the first day." We both got up to investigate. The fork was perfectly balanced, standing impossibly on its end. There was no way it could have fallen into that position by accident. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," I suggested, not really believing it myself. "Or the house settling made it fall out of the case somehow." Jake picked up the fork gingerly. "The case is still locked, see?" He pointed to the display cabinet, which was indeed still securely closed. "And look how far away it is. There's no way it could have rolled over here on its own." We searched the house, but found no signs of an intruder. All the doors and windows were locked. We even checked the security system Jake had installed when he first got the place. It hadn't registered any motion or open doors. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. But nothing else happened. The next morning, we were both exhausted and on edge. We decided to pack up and head back to our own places for the weekend. Jake locked up the fork with the rest of the set, and we made sure everything was secure before we left. I tried to put it out of my mind over the next week. It was weird, sure, but there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe we were more tired than we realized, and one of us had moved it without remembering. Or maybe Jake's aunt had some elaborate hidden mechanism as a practical joke. I came up with all sorts of theories to try to rationalize it. But then the following weekend, it happened again. And this time, it was even creepier. We had gone back to the house to continue clearing things out. Everything seemed normal at first. We worked through the afternoon, stopping occasionally to examine particularly interesting items we came across. As the sun started to set, Jake suggested we call it a day. We were walking out to our cars when he suddenly froze, staring at something near the front gate. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Look." There, carefully balanced in one of the bushes flanking the gate, was the knife from the carving set. It was positioned with almost surgical precision, its blade gleaming in the fading sunlight. My blood ran cold. This was no accident or trick of tired minds. Someone, or something, had deliberately placed it there. "We need to call the cops," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Jake nodded, already pulling out his phone. We waited by the cars, neither of us wanting to get any closer to the knife. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They did a thorough search of the property, but found no signs of forced entry or any other disturbances. They dusted the knife for prints, but came up empty. "Look, we'll increase patrols in the area," the officer told us. "But honestly, unless we catch someone in the act, there's not much we can do. You might want to consider installing some security cameras." We took his advice. The next day, we had a professional security company come out and set up cameras covering every angle of the house and yard. Jake also changed all the locks, just to be safe. For the next couple weeks, we were on high alert every time we went to the house. But nothing happened. The cameras didn't pick up any unusual activity. The carving set stayed locked away in its case. We started to relax a little, thinking maybe whoever was messing with us had gotten scared off by the increased security. We were wrong. It was a Tuesday night. I had come over after work to help Jake move some furniture. We had just finished up and were having a beer on the back porch when both our phones buzzed simultaneously. It was an alert from the security system. We pulled up the app and saw that motion had been detected in the front yard. Heart pounding, I clicked on the live feed from the camera. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then movement caught my eye, something small and shiny arcing through the air. It was the serving spoon from the carving set, spinning end over end as if thrown by an invisible hand. We watched in horror as it landed with a soft thud in the middle of the front lawn, its handle pointing directly at the house. Jake and I looked at each other, both of us pale and shaking. Without a word, we grabbed our things and got the hell out of there. We called the police again, but they were just as baffled as before. The security footage clearly showed the spoon's trajectory, but there was no sign of anyone throwing it. The cameras hadn't picked up any other movement or presence in the yard. Jake put the house on the market the next day. He moved all the valuables, including that damn carving set, to a storage unit. As far as I know, nothing else has happened since then. But I still lie awake some nights, wondering who or what was behind it all. What was the purpose of arranging those objects in such specific ways? Was it some elaborate prank or something more sinister? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never look at antiques the same way again. And if I ever inherit a house full of creepy old stuff, I'm selling it sight unseen. As I was turning off lights and locking up, I noticed my old Winnie the Pooh stuffed bear sitting on a shelf in the living room. It had been mine as a kid, and my mom had kept it all these years for nostalgia's sake. I hadn't thought about that bear in ages. On a whim, I picked it up and took it with me to the guest room where I was sleeping. Maybe I was feeling a bit lonely in the empty house and wanted the company, as silly as that sounds. I placed Pooh on the nightstand next to the bed and settled in to sleep. I drifted off pretty quickly, exhausted from a long day at work. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound in the darkness. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it again, a mechanical whirring noise coming from right next to me. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 5:03 a.m. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light from my phone screen, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice say, "Hello, friend." It was coming from the direction of the nightstand. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the Pooh Bear talking. Now, this wasn't some fancy electronic toy. This was an old, basic stuffed animal from the 80s. It had never had any kind of voice or moving parts. Yet here it was, speaking on its own in the middle of the night. Frozen in terror, I watched as the bear's head slowly turned towards me. Its black button eyes seemed to stare right into my soul as its mouth moved, speaking again. "I like honey." I let out a strangled yelp and scrambled backwards, nearly falling off the other side of the bed. This couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming. I pinched myself hard, but I was wide awake. The bear just kept talking, spewing out phrases in that cheerful Winnie the Pooh voice. Oh, bother. Let's go on an adventure. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had someone replaced my old bear with some kind of automated toy as a prank? But who would do that? And how would they have gotten into the locked house? Was I hallucinating from lack of sleep? Or was something truly supernatural occurring? I couldn't take my eyes off the bear as it continued to move and speak. Its limbs were twitching, and its head was rotating unnaturally. This was so wrong. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. Finally, I managed to unfreeze myself from the paralysis of fear. I leapt out of bed and bolted for the bedroom door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. As I ran down the hall, I could still hear that horrible mechanical voice echoing behind me. "Where are you going, friend?" I didn't stop running until I was out the front door and halfway down the street. The cool night air helped clear my head a bit, but I was still trembling uncontrollably. There was no way I was going back in that house alone. Without really thinking it through, I got in my car and drove straight to my grandmother's house across town. It was barely 5:30 a.m. at this point, but I desperately needed to not be alone. I pounded on her door until she answered, looking confused and concerned. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour?" she asked as she ushered me inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what had happened, but it all came out in a barely coherent ramble. My grandmother listened patiently, then made me sit down while she fixed me a cup of tea to calm my nerves. "I know it sounds crazy," I finished lamely, "but I swear it really happened. That bear was talking and moving on its own." My grandmother patted my hand. "I believe that you believe it happened, dear. But surely there must be some logical explanation. Why don't you rest here for a bit and we'll go back to the house together once it's light out? Everything seems scarier in the dark." I nodded glumly, knowing how insane my story sounded. But I knew what I had seen and heard. That bear had come to life, and I was terrified to go near it again. A few hours later, after the sun had risen, my grandmother drove me back to my parents' house. Everything looked so normal in the daylight. Had I imagined the whole thing? We cautiously entered the guest room where I'd been sleeping. The Pooh Bear was still sitting on the nightstand where I'd left it, looking perfectly innocent and inanimate. My grandmother picked it up and examined it closely. "See? It's just an ordinary stuffed toy," she said gently. "You must have had a very vivid nightmare." I wanted to believe her, but I knew deep down that it hadn't been a dream. Still, I let her think she had reassured me. I didn't want her to worry. After she left, I stood there staring at the bear for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw it in the trash, but I was honestly too scared to touch it. What if it started talking again the moment I picked it up? In the end, I compromised by shoving it in a box and burying it in the back of a closet. I told my parents some story about accidentally damaging it when they got home and asked about the missing bear. It's been years now, and that bear has never shown any signs of life again. Sometimes I wonder if I really did just have an incredibly realistic nightmare or hallucination that night. But in my heart, I know what I experienced was real. I've never been able to look at any Winnie the Pooh merchandise the same way since. Those cheerful characters now fill me with a deep sense of unease. I still have no explanation for what happened that night. All I know is that it shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I swear I can still hear that mechanical voice in the distance. "Hello, friend. I like honey." And I shudder, wondering if that cursed bear will ever come to life again. I was so excited for our camping trip to Big Bend National Park. My boyfriend Lucas had been talking about it for months, and we finally managed to get time off work to make it happen. We decided to go with his best friend Jordan and Jordan's sister Clara to make it a real adventure. The drive from Houston was long but beautiful. As we entered the park, I was struck by how vast and wild it felt. The rugged landscapes and towering cliffs were unlike anything I'd seen before. We found a secluded spot to set up camp, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by scraggly juniper trees. That first day was perfect. We hiked, took photos of the incredible vistas, and sat around the campfire laughing and telling stories late into the night. I remember feeling so content as I drifted off to sleep in our tent, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it, a faint, eerie whistling sound coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. I nudged Lucas awake and whispered for him to listen. The whistling continued, rising and falling in pitch. It didn't sound like any bird or animal I'd ever heard. "It's probably just the wind," Lucas mumbled sleepily. But I could tell from the tension in his voice that he was unsettled too. We lay there listening for what felt like hours. Just as I was starting to relax, convinced it must have been the wind after all, I heard twigs snapping nearby, like something was walking around our campsite. My heart started racing. I gripped Lucas's arm tightly as the footsteps circled our tent. Suddenly I heard Jordan's voice call out, "Hey guys, you up? I thought I heard something out here." Relief washed over me. I unzipped the tent, ready to tell Jordan about the weird noises. But when I poked my head out, there was no one there. The campsite was empty and silent. "Jordan?" I called softly. No response. Lucas sat up, looking confused. "What's going on?" I thought I heard Jordan just now. He was right outside the tent." Lucas frowned. "That's weird. Maybe you were dreaming?" I shook my head. "No, I was wide awake. I heard him clear as day." We woke Jordan and Clara in the other tent to see if everything was okay. They both swore they'd been sound asleep and hadn't left their tent. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as we all agreed to keep watch in shifts for the rest of the night. Nothing else happened, but I barely slept a wink. The next morning, we tried to shake off the weirdness and enjoy our hike, but things only got stranger. Our backpacks had been rifled through, with snacks and water bottles missing. We found strange marks gouged into nearby trees, 3 parallel lines that looked almost like claw marks. I tried to convince myself it was just some mischievous raccoons or something, but deep down, I knew this was different. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. That night around the campfire, the mood was tense. No one wanted to talk about the weird stuff happening, but I could tell everyone was on edge. We turned in early, agreeing to stick to our watch shifts. I had just dozed off when Clara's terrified scream jolted me awake. I scrambled out of the tent to see her pointing at something in the trees, her face white with fear. "There's someone out there," she cried. I saw a face, but it wasn't human. Lucas and Jordan grabbed flashlights and searched the area, but found nothing. Clara was inconsolable, insisting she'd seen glowing eyes and a twisted, inhuman face peering at her from the darkness. None of us slept after that. We huddled around the fire, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. As the sky began to lighten, I thought the worst was over. I was so wrong. Jordan stood up to stretch his legs, walking to the edge of our campsite. Suddenly he froze. "Guys," he said in a strangled voice, "look." We all turned to see what he was staring at. My blood ran cold. There, pressed into the soft dirt, was a massive footprint, easily twice the size of a human foot. But that wasn't the worst part. The print was misshapen, with elongated toes ending in what looked like sharp claws. Panic set in. We started packing up camp as fast as we could, all of us babbling in fear about what could have made that print. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. We sprinted for our RV, throwing our gear inside haphazardly. Lucas fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The growling got louder, closer. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees, a tall, dark shape that seemed to shift and change as it moved. Just as Lucas got the engine started, an inhuman screech split the air. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard, like a mixture of a woman's scream and an animal's roar. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to shake violently. We peeled out of there, the RV's tires kicking up dust and gravel. I looked back and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was emerging from the tree line, a creature I can barely describe. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, but its shape kept changing, warping in impossible ways. As we sped down the road, I heard voices calling out to us, but they were our own voices, pleading for us to come back, to help them. The creature was mimicking us perfectly. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound of my own voice begging me to stop. We didn't slow down until we reached the park entrance. As we pulled onto the main highway, we all sat in shocked silence, trying to process what had just happened. That's when Clara noticed Jordan was missing. In our panic to escape, somehow Jordan had been left behind. We debated going back, calling the rangers, anything, but the terror was too fresh. We couldn't bring ourselves to return to that place. It's been 6 months since that night. The police searched, but no trace of Jordan was ever found. I still have nightmares about that twisted face in the trees, still wake up hearing that awful mimicry of our voices. I don't know what we encountered in Big Bend that night. I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the horror of realizing that the creature stalking us could sound exactly like the people we loved and use that against us in the most terrifying way possible. I stepped out of my beat-up Jeep Cherokee, the gravel crunching beneath my hiking boots as I surveyed the dense expanse of Davy Crockett National Forest stretching out before me. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, casting long shadows across the ground. I inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth. This solo camping trip was supposed to help clear my head, to give me some peace after everything. It had been 6 months since I lost Rebecca. 6 months of sleepless nights, of reaching across an empty bed, of coming home to a silent house. The grief counselor had suggested this trip, a chance to reconnect with nature and with myself. But standing there at the trailhead, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, I wasn't so sure anymore. I shook off the doubts and started down the trail, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird song or rustle in the underbrush. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. After about an hour, I came across a small clearing and decided to set up camp for the night. As I was pitching my tent, I heard the snap of a twig behind me. I whirled around to see an old man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. "Whoa there, didn't mean to startle you," he said, raising his hands. "Name's Klein, live just down the way. Don't get many visitors out this far." I introduced myself, trying to hide how much he'd rattled me. Klein was tall and wiry, with a long gray beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Ethan, huh?" he said, stroking his beard. "What brings you out to these parts, Ethan?" I hesitated, not wanting to get into the whole story with a stranger. Just needed to get away for a bit, clear my head. Klein nodded slowly. "These woods have a way of doing that, but they can play tricks on a man too, especially one who's carrying something heavy." His eyes bored into mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. Klein just shook his head. "Best be careful out here is all. Things aren't always what they seem." With that cryptic warning, he turned and melted back into the trees, leaving me standing there confused and more than a little unsettled. As night fell, I built a small fire and heated up some canned soup for dinner. The flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing, and every rustle in the darkness made me jump. Klein's words kept echoing in my mind. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was just on edge from being alone in an unfamiliar place. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipping up the flaps securely behind me. Despite my exhaustion from the hike, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of Rebecca, of the life we'd planned together, now lost forever. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Ethan." My blood ran cold. That voice, I'd know it anywhere. It was Rebecca's voice. "Ethan, where are you? I need you." I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I must be dreaming or going crazy from grief and isolation. "Please, Ethan, I'm lost. Help me." The voice seemed to be coming from just outside my tent. With shaking hands, I unzipped the flap and peered out into the darkness. The clearing was empty, the fire now just glowing embers. But the voice came again from deeper in the woods. "This way, Ethan. Follow me." Before I knew what I was doing, I was out of the tent, stumbling barefoot into the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I pushed through the underbrush, following that achingly familiar voice. "Rebecca," I called out. "Rebecca, where are you?" But there was no answer now, just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the pounding of my own heart. I realized I'd wandered far from my campsite, and I had no idea which direction I'd come from. Panic started to set in as I spun in circles, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw it, a faint light through the trees. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was another camper, someone who could help me. I pushed towards the light, ignoring the thorns that tore at my bare feet. I burst into another small clearing and stopped short. There in the center stood a dilapidated wooden cabin. The light I'd seen came from inside, flickering like candlelight through the cracks in the walls. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I found myself drawn towards the cabin. As I approached, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood around the door frame, twisting alien shapes that made my head hurt to look at them. With a trembling hand, I reached out and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a long, low creak. The interior was a single room, bare save for a rickety table in the center. On the table sat a single candle, its flame dancing in a non-existent breeze. And there, on the far side of the room, stood Rebecca. She looked just as she had the day she died, long brown hair falling in waves around her shoulders, wearing the blue sundress I'd always loved. But something was off. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent in the candlelight, and her eyes, God, her eyes were wrong. Black and empty, like holes cut into her face. "Hello, Ethan," she said, and her voice was Rebecca's but not Rebecca's, layered and distorted as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my back hitting the door frame. This wasn't Rebecca. This wasn't real. The thing wearing Rebecca's face smiled, but the expression was all wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth. "Don't you want to be with me, Ethan? Don't you miss me?" It took a step towards me, and I could see now that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. Terror gripped me, paralyzing me as it drifted closer. "Join me in the shadows, Ethan," it whispered. "We can be together forever." Its hand reached for me, fingers elongating into razor-sharp claws. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place, transfixed by those horrible black eyes. Just as the creature's claws were about to touch my face, a gust of wind blew through the cabin, making the candle flame gutter. The scent of sage filled the air, sharp and pungent. The thing that wasn't Rebecca recoiled, hissing in pain. "No!" it shrieked, its voice no longer anything like Rebecca's. "You cannot banish me." But the sage smell grew stronger, and the creature began to dissolve, its form twisting and warping like smoke in the wind. With a final, inhuman howl, it vanished. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking and gasping for breath. When I finally managed to move, I bolted from the cabin, running blindly through the woods. By some miracle, I found my way back to my campsite just as dawn was breaking. I threw my gear haphazardly into my backpack, not even bothering to take down the tent. I just needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization and away from whatever the hell I'd encountered in those woods. As I was shoving the last of my things into the Jeep, I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around, half expecting to see that terrible, false version of Rebecca again. But it was just Klein, regarding me with those unnervingly piercing eyes. "Leaving so soon?" he asked mildly. I nodded, unable to form words. Klein reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag, holding it out to me. "Sage," he explained. "For protection. Seems like you might need it." I took the bag with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the implication that Klein somehow knew what had happened to me. "To thank you," I managed to stammer out. Klein just nodded. "Be careful out there, Ethan, and remember, not everything that calls to us should be answered." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he'd appeared. I climbed into my Jeep and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from Davy Crockett National Forest, I've never been camping again. Sometimes late at night, I still hear Rebecca's voice calling to me. But now I know better than to follow it into the dark. I'd gone there seeking solace and a break from the constant barrage of trauma I'd been exposed to. The rugged wilderness of West Texas seemed like the perfect place to decompress and clear my head. How wrong I was. It started innocently enough. I arrived at the park on a crisp autumn morning, the sun peeking over the craggy peaks. The air was crisp and clean, a welcome change from the acrid smoke of battlefields. I checked in at the visitor center and chatted with a friendly park ranger about the best trails and campsites. Everything felt peaceful and normal. As I was loading up my backpack, an elderly Hispanic woman approached me. She introduced herself as Maria and said she ran a small trading post just outside the park. There was an odd intensity in her eyes as she spoke. "Be careful out there," she warned, her voice low. "The mountains hide many secrets. Watch out for the devil's smile." I chuckled and assured her I'd be fine, chalking it up to local superstition. If only I'd heeded her words. The first couple days of my trip were uneventful. I hiked during the day, marveling at the stark beauty of the desert landscape. At night I camped under a dazzling canopy of stars, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. On the third day, things began to change. I was reviewing some photos I'd taken on my camera when the device suddenly went haywire, cycling through images at lightning speed before shutting off completely. When I turned it back on, all the photos were gone. Annoyed, but not overly concerned, I continued on my hike. As the day wore on, I began to feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept whipping around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was never anyone there, just empty trail and scrubby desert plants. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence of the wilderness felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf set me on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid, that years of working in war zones had made me jumpy. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I woke before dawn, eager to break camp and move on. But as I went to pack up my gear, I realized my map was missing. I searched frantically, knowing I'd left it right by my sleeping bag the night before. It was nowhere to be found. Unsettled but determined to press on, I set off down the trail. The once beautiful landscape now felt menacing. Jagged rocks cast ominous shadows. Gnarled juniper trees looked like clawed hands reaching out to grab me. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw a figure in the distance. Tall and unnaturally thin, it stood motionless on the path ahead. Relief flooded through me. Another hiker. I quickened my pace, eager for human contact. But as I drew closer, that relief turned to ice-cold dread. The figure's proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, neck craned at an impossible angle. And its face, dear God, its face. An impossibly wide grin split its features, filled with far too many teeth. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. My heart pounding, I sprinted down the trail, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I'd just seen. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. I abandoned my planned route, instead making a beeline for the closest ranger station. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling of being pursued. As night fell, I was forced to make camp again. I hadn't seen any other hikers all day. My phone had no signal. I was utterly alone. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me flinch. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision. And always, I felt eyes on me. In the darkest hour of the night, I heard something moving outside my tent. Slow, dragging footsteps. My body went rigid with terror as they drew closer and closer. A shadow fell across the tent wall. Long, spindly fingers pressed against the fabric. And then, a voice, but not a human voice. It was like 100 whispers layered on top of each other, hissing and sibilant. "Ryan," it said, "why did you leave us to die, Ryan?" I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. The voice continued, relentless. "You could have saved us, but you ran. You always run." Memories flashed through my mind. A bombed-out village in Syria, the screams of civilians as I fled to safety. An ambush in Afghanistan where I'd abandoned my local translator to save myself. "No," I whimpered. "I'm sorry. I had no choice." "Liar," the voices hissed. "Coward." I don't know how long I huddled there, shaking and sobbing as the entity outside my tent dredged up every painful memory, every moment of guilt and shame from my years as a war correspondent. It felt like hours, days, an eternity. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I burst out of my tent, wild-eyed and frantic. There was no sign of any intruder, no footprints in the dirt, but scratched into a nearby tree trunk was that same horrific grin I'd seen on the figure's face. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I couldn't run anymore, I walked. I walked until I reached the edge of the park, where I collapsed in the parking lot of Maria's trading post. Maria found me there, dehydrated and babbling incoherently about smiles and whispers in the dark. She brought me inside, gave me water, listened to my story without judgment. When I'd finished, she nodded gravely. "The devil's smile," she said. "It feeds on guilt and fear, on the darkness in men's souls." She rummaged in a drawer and pulled out a bundle of dried herbs. "Burn this," she instructed, "and burn anything the entity might have touched. It will break its hold on you." I did as she said, burning the herbs along with my journal, where I'd recorded my experiences in the park. As the pages turned to ash, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It's been a month since I left Guadalupe Mountains. I haven't returned to my job. I'm not sure I ever will. The nightmares still come sometimes. That stretching grin, those accusing whispers, but they're fading. I don't know if what I experienced was real or some kind of psychological break. All I know is that I went into those mountains seeking peace, and instead I found a horror beyond imagining. A horror that knew me, knew my deepest shames and regrets. A horror with a smile as wide as the Texas sky. I'm sharing this story as a warning. If you visit Guadalupe Mountains National Park, be careful. Be very, very careful. And if you hear whispers in the night, run. Run and don't look back. We arrived at the park late afternoon and set up camp in the Chisos Basin campground. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, we sat around the campfire grilling hot dogs and excitedly discussing our plans for the next few days. We wanted to do some of the more challenging hikes and really get out into the backcountry. That first night passed uneventfully. We crawled into our tents around 11 p.m., tired from the long drive. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a woman's voice, soft but clear, calling, "Help me, Please, somebody help me. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere in the woods beyond our campsite. My heart started racing. Who could be out there at this hour? Was someone hurt or lost? I unzipped my tent and peered out. The campground was silent and still, bathed in pale moonlight. I couldn't see anyone moving around. "Jake? Sam?" I whispered. "Did you guys hear that?" No response. They must still be asleep. I heard the voice again, a little louder this time. "Please, I need help. Is anyone there?" I grabbed my headlamp and slipped on my hiking boots, determined to investigate. As I stepped out of the tent, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an unseen energy. I swept my headlamp beam across the campsite and surrounding trees. Nothing moved in the shadows. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Silence. Then, from much closer this time, "Emma, Emma, help me." I froze. That voice, it sounded exactly like my mother, but that was impossible. My mom was back home in Houston, hundreds of miles away. How could she be here? Fear gripped me as I spun around, searching desperately for the source of the voice. "Mom!" I choked out. A twig snapped in the woods to my left. I whirled toward the sound, heart pounding. My headlamp illuminated a pale figure standing just beyond the tree line. For a split second I thought I saw my mother's face, her eyes wide with terror. Then the image seemed to shimmer and distort, melting into something else. Something that made my blood run cold. I screamed and stumbled backwards, falling hard onto the ground. Jake and Sam burst out of their tents, shouting in confusion. "Emma, what's wrong?" Jake rushed to my side, helping me up. I was shaking uncontrollably. "There's something out there," I gasped. "I heard voices. I thought I saw—" Sam was scanning the woods with his flashlight. "I don't see anything," he said. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I described what I'd heard and seen. Jake and Sam exchanged worried glances. "Let's pack up and get out of here," Jake said. "We can find another campsite." But as we started gathering our gear, an eerie howl echoed through the night. It started low, then rose to a bone-chilling shriek that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. We all froze, staring wide-eyed at each other. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered. Before anyone could respond, we heard it again, closer this time, much closer. And now it was followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, heading straight for our camp. Panic exploded in my chest. We abandoned our half-packed gear and ran for the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, swearing as he dropped them. The crashing sounds were almost upon us. Finally, Jake got the car started. We peeled out of the campsite, tires spitting gravel. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a dark shape emerging from the trees. Then we were speeding down the road, away from whatever that thing was. We drove for almost an hour, nerves frayed, jumping at every shadow. Eventually, we found an RV park just outside the national park boundaries. We parked there for the night, too shaken to sleep. As dawn broke, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just some kind of weird prank. Or had we all somehow shared some kind of mass hallucination? We decided to head back to our campsite in the daylight to retrieve our abandoned gear. But when we got there, we found our tents and equipment shredded to ribbons. Deep claw marks scored the trees around the campsite, and spelled out in the dirt was a chilling message. "I see you." That was enough for Sam. He insisted we leave immediately, head back to civilization. Jake and I were reluctant to give up on our trip, but we were both pretty freaked out too. We compromised by agreeing to stay one more night, but at a different campground in a more populated area of the park. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off our unease and enjoy the stunning desert scenery. As night fell, we built a roaring campfire and huddled close, still jumpy from the previous night's events. Around midnight, Sam said he was turning in. Jake and I stayed up a little longer, talking in low voices. That's when we heard Sam cry out from his tent. We rushed over. "Sam, you okay in there?" Jake called. No answer. Jake unzipped the tent and found it empty. "What the—" Jake breathed. "Sam! Sam!" We searched the entire campground, calling Sam's name. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Jake wanted to go to the Rangers right away, but I convinced him to wait until morning. Sam was an adult after all. Maybe he'd just gone for a walk and gotten turned around in the dark. We sat up the rest of the night, watching for any sign of Sam. I've never been so glad to see the sun rise. As soon as the ranger station opened, we reported Sam missing. Search and rescue teams combed the area all day, but found no trace of our friend. They told us to head home, that they'd contact us with any news. Jake and I were packing up our remaining gear, shell-shocked and heartsick, when I heard it again, that woman's voice calling for help. This time it was Sam's voice mixed in too. "Jake," I said, my voice shaking, "please tell me you hear that." The color drained from his face. He heard it too. The voices got louder, more frantic, pleading with us by name to help them. They seemed to be coming from all directions at once. "We have to go," Jake said. "Now." We sprinted for the car. I just reached for the door handle when an ear-splitting shriek pierced the air. I turned to see Jake frozen in place, staring in horror at something behind me. I'll never forget the look of pure terror on his face in that moment. His mouth opened in a silent scream as he was suddenly yanked backwards with impossible speed, disappearing into the trees. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran until my lungs were on fire, until I thought my heart would burst. I have no idea how long or how far I ran. I just know that somehow I made it to the main road where a startled couple in an RV picked me up. The police and park rangers searched for days. They never found a trace of Jake or Sam. It's been 3 months, and I still wake up screaming most nights. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. I hear whispers sometimes, just on the edge of hearing. Familiar voices calling my name. I don't know what happened out there in Big Bend. I don't know what took my friends, but I know it's still out there, and I'm terrified that one day it's going to come for me too. I was a wildlife photographer for over a decade, capturing breathtaking images of nature's beauty across the globe. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror I encountered at Cato Lake last summer. Even now, months later, I struggle to make sense of what happened there. The memories haunt me, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about our world. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week-long trip to photograph the diverse wildlife around Cato Lake for a nature magazine. I'd heard it was a hidden gem, teeming with unique species. As I drove down the winding forest road toward the lake, I felt that familiar excitement building. New landscapes to explore, new creatures to capture through my lens. The sun was setting as I pulled into the small parking area by the shore. Golden light danced on the water's surface, and a chorus of frogs and crickets filled the air. It was breathtakingly serene. I grabbed my camera and took a few test shots, already envisioning the photo essay I'd create. As I was setting up my tent for the night, an elderly woman approached from a nearby cabin. She introduced herself as Darla, a long-time resident of the area. We chatted casually about the lake and local wildlife. But as she turned to leave, she paused and fixed me with an intense stare. "Be careful out there," she said in a low voice, "especially after dark. They say the Witch of Cato Lake still haunts these waters." I chuckled, assuming it was just local folklore meant to spook tourists. "I'll keep an eye out," I replied with a wink. Darla didn't smile back. She just nodded gravely and shuffled away. I dismissed the encounter and focused on preparing for the next day's shoot. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The darkness seemed oppressive, the silence too complete. I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred up by Darla's warning. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. A hauntingly beautiful melody woke me sometime in the early morning hours. Still half asleep, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The full moon illuminated a blanket of mist hovering over the lake, and there, at the water's edge, I saw her. A woman in a flowing white dress stood with her back to me, singing softly. Her long dark hair cascaded down her back. Something about the scene felt wrong, but I was mesmerized. Without thinking, I grabbed my camera and crept closer, compelled to capture this ethereal moment. I raised the viewfinder to my eye and froze. Through the lens, I could see the woman's face reflected in the water. But it wasn't a face at all, just a horrifying black void where features should be. My finger instinctively pressed the shutter as icy dread washed over me. The singing stopped abruptly. The figure turned, revealing that same featureless void. A raspy whisper carried across the water. "Join me, Marcus." Paralyzing terror gripped me as the thing that wasn't a woman began gliding toward me across the surface of the lake. Pale, corpse-like arms reached out, grasping. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. In a panic, I fled to my car and sped away, tires skidding on the gravel. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. Pulling over at a rest stop, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. It had to have been a nightmare, right? Some terrifying hallucination brought on by Darla's story and my own overactive imagination. But when I checked my camera with shaking hands, my blood ran cold. There, in crisp digital clarity, was the photo I'd taken. The back of a woman in white, her distorted face reflected in the water. But that wasn't the worst part. In the background, barely visible in the mist, were dozens of pale figures standing motionless on the lake's surface, watching. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that impossible image. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend none of it had happened. But I knew I needed proof, something to validate the terror I'd experienced. When I finally worked up the courage to scroll through the other photos from that night, my hands began to tremble. In shot after shot of the serene lakeside scenery, I spotted that same white-clad figure, sometimes just a glimpse between trees, other times staring directly at the camera from the shadows. She had been there all along, watching me, and I never noticed. I wanted nothing more than to flee, to put as much distance between myself and Cato Lake as possible. But I knew I couldn't leave without my camping gear. Forcing down my fear, I decided to make one quick trip back to gather my things in broad daylight. The drive back to the lake was torture. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every flash of white made me flinch. But the campsite looked perfectly normal in the morning sun. I started to wonder if I really had imagined it all. Then I saw Darla hobbling down the path toward me. The grave look on her face confirmed my worst fears before she even spoke. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "The Witch of Cato Lake." I nodded, unable to find words. Darla sighed heavily. "It's been happening more and more lately," she continued. "People coming to the lake, then fleeing in terror. Some Some don't make it out at all. A chill ran down my spine as she recounted the lake's dark history. Centuries ago, a woman accused of witchcraft was drowned here by superstitious villagers. Ever since, her vengeful spirit has haunted the waters, luring in unsuspecting victims with her siren song. "But why me?" I asked. "Why did she know my name?" Darla shook her head sadly. "She knows everything about this place, everyone who enters her domain." As we talked, I noticed movement out on the lake, a pale form drifting just beneath the surface. Darla saw my widening eyes and quickly ushered me toward my car. "You need to leave, now, and don't come back," she warned. "She's chosen you. She'll keep trying to drag you into the depths." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw my gear in the trunk and peeled out of there, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. In the rear-view mirror, I swore I saw a figure in white standing in the middle of the road, growing smaller as I sped away. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to convince myself it was all some kind of shared delusion. Surely there must be a rational explanation for what I saw and photographed. But deep down, I know the truth. I still have nightmares about pale arms reaching up from black water. Sometimes I wake to the faint sound of singing in the distance. And worst of all, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. In reflections, in shadows, out of the corner of my eye. I catch glimpses of a woman in white, waiting, beckoning. I don't know if I'll ever be free of the witch of Cato Lake, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never set foot near that cursed place again. And I pray that anyone reading this will heed my warning and stay far, far away from those haunted waters. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. The day started normally enough. I arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, setting up my small camp and gear. As dusk approached, I began my trek into the depths of the woods, armed with my camera, night vision equipment, and a backpack full of supplies. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, owls hooting, small animals scurrying about. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as night fully set in, something changed. The air grew unnaturally still and cold. An eerie silence descended, as if all the wildlife had suddenly vanished. That's when I first noticed the light. It started as a faint glow in the distance, a soft blue-green hue that seemed to dance between the trees. At first, I thought it might be some kind of bioluminescent fungus or insect. Excited by the prospect of documenting a rare phenomenon, I moved towards it. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, pulsing gently. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even. But then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Rowan," it said, my name carried on a non-existent breeze. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. The light began to move, weaving through the trees with an unnatural grace, and with growing horror, I realized it was leading me deeper into the forest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run to the safety of my camp, but I couldn't. It was as if the light had hooked something deep inside me, pulling me along against my will. Hours passed as I followed the witch light. That's what I came to call it in my mind. The forest around me grew denser, darker. My flashlight beam seemed pitiful compared to the otherworldly glow that guided and tormented me. I lost all sense of direction, of time. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they seemed to come from the light itself, other times from the shadows all around me. "Come closer, Rowan," they urged. "We have so much to show you." I don't know how long I wandered, trapped in that nightmarish game of follow the leader. But eventually I stumbled into a small clearing. The witch light hovered at its center, pulsing brighter than ever. And that's when I saw them, shadows moving at the edge of the clearing. Human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows crept closer, their forms flickering and distorting in the ethereal light. I could hear their breathing now, raspy and hungry. The witch light's whispers grew to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices promising knowledge, power, and horrors beyond imagining. Just as I thought I would lose my mind, a new sound cut through the chaos, the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. The witch light flickered, the shadows retreated, and suddenly I could move again. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back to camp. The sky was starting to lighten when I finally collapsed by my tent, gasping for air and shaking uncontrollably. As the sun rose, the horrors of the night seemed to fade like a bad dream. But I knew it had been real. The scratches on my arms and face, the mud caking my clothes, they were evidence enough. I packed up camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my shoelaces. As I drove out of the forest, I stopped at a small general store to grab some water and snacks for the long drive home. That's where I met her, an old woman behind the counter, her eyes sharp and knowing. She took one look at me and said, "You've seen it, haven't you? The witch light." I nodded, unable to speak. She sighed, reaching under the counter to pull out a small leather pouch. "Take this," she said, pressing it into my hand. "It's a protection charm. Won't stop the light entirely, but it'll help keep it at bay." I wanted to ask her a million questions. How did she know? What exactly was the witch light? But my voice failed me, and she shooed me out of the store with a warning. "Don't come back to these woods, boy. Some things aren't meant for mortal eyes." I didn't need to be told twice. I drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as exhaustion or some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something ancient and terrible lurked in that forest, something that defied scientific explanation. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over folklore and myths, searching for answers. I found scattered references to similar phenomena, will-o'-the-wisps, ghost lights, and other luring spirits. But nothing quite matched what I had experienced. I never returned to the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. My colleagues thought I was crazy when I refused to go back, when I switched my research focus to less remote areas. But they hadn't seen what I had seen. They hadn't heard the whispers or felt the pull of that unearthly light. Sometimes, on dark nights, I still dream of it. The blue-green glow, the shadows at the edge of my vision. I wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for the protection charm that I now keep by my bedside. It's a reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain, forces beyond our comprehension. I don't know if the witch light was trying to harm me or if it had some other purpose. But I do know this. There are places in this world where the veil between realities is thin, where ancient powers still hold sway. And if you ever find yourself in such a place, if you ever see a beautiful beckoning light in the depths of a dark forest, run, run, and don't look back. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened, and sometimes the price of knowledge is far too high to pay. It started as an innocent hiking trip. I had a few days off work and decided to explore the area around the Superstition Wilderness. Armed with maps, supplies, and way too much enthusiasm, I set off into the rugged terrain early one morning. The landscape was breathtaking. Towering saguaro cacti, jagged rock formations, and expansive views in every direction. But there was also an undercurrent of eeriness that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the knowledge of all the people who had vanished in these mountains over the years. Or maybe it was something else entirely. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, I kept getting the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I'd whip my head around, certain I'd seen movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. Just rocks and cacti as far as I could see. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but the sensation persisted. Around midday, I reached an area known as Devil's Roost, a maze-like section of canyons and rock formations. According to the legend, this was near where the fabled mine was supposed to be hidden. As I paused to check my map and take a water break, I heard a voice call out, "Hey there, you lost?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. Spinning around, I saw a woman in a park ranger uniform approaching me. She introduced herself as Maggie Porter and explained she was out on patrol. I stammered out that I was just exploring the area, trying not to look as rattled as I felt. Maggie eyed me skeptically. "You're not another treasure hunter, are you? We get too many of those around here." I assured her I was just a hiker, though I did admit my interest in the Lost Dutchman legend. Something in Maggie's expression changed when I mentioned it. She got a faraway look in her eyes. "My brother was obsessed with that story," she said quietly. "He came out here looking for the mine 5 years ago, never came back." An uncomfortable silence fell between us. I didn't know what to say. Eventually, Maggie shook herself out of whatever memory she'd been lost in. "Listen, be careful out here, okay? It's easy to get turned around, and well, just watch yourself." With that cryptic warning, she headed off to continue her patrol. I stood there for a while, unsure whether to continue or turn back. In the end, curiosity won out, and I pressed on into Devil's Roost. The canyons were like a natural maze, with towering rock walls on all sides. I carefully picked my way through, referring to my map frequently. But after an hour or so, I realized with growing unease that I was completely lost. The walls all looked the same, and nothing on my map seemed to match up with what I was seeing. That's when things started to get really weird. My phone, which had been working fine all day, suddenly went dead. Not just out of signal, completely unresponsive. Same with my GPS device. Even my watch had stopped. I told myself not to panic. I still had my map and compass, but when I pulled out the compass, the needle was spinning wildly, not settling in any direction. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I decided to retrace my steps and try to find my way back out. But as I turned to go back the way I came, I froze in shock. Where there had been an open path just moments ago, there was now a solid rock wall. It was if the very landscape was shifting around me. That's when I saw it for the first time, a dark, shadowy figure at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look directly at it, it vanished, but I could feel its presence lingering, watching me. Heart pounding, I picked a direction at random and started walking quickly. I had to get out of there. But no matter which way I went, I couldn't seem to find an exit from the maze-like canyons. And all the while, that shadow kept appearing and disappearing, always just out of reach. As the sun began to set, real fear set in. I was lost in a place where people had been known to vanish without a trace. And I was being stalked by something. something that defied explanation. In desperation, I started climbing up the canyon walls, hoping to get a better vantage point. It was treacherous going. The rock was loose and crumbly in places. About halfway up, my foot slipped, and I felt myself starting to fall. In that moment of terror, a hand grabbed my arm and hauled me up onto a ledge. It was Maggie. I have no idea how she found me, but I've never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. "We need to get out of here. Now." Her voice was tight with fear. As we picked our way along the ledge, I filled her in on the bizarre things I'd experienced. To my surprise, she didn't seem skeptical at all. If anything, she looked grimly unsurprised. "I've seen it too," she said quietly. "That shadow. It's why I became a ranger, to try to find out what happened to my brother. I think it took him." A bone-deep chill went through me at her words. What the hell had I stumbled into? We had almost reached what looked like a way down when an unearthly shriek split the air. Maggie and I both instinctively ducked, looking around wildly for the source. That's when we saw it. The shadow had taken on a more solid form, a towering, pitch-black figure that seemed to absorb the fading light around it. It was blocking our path forward. "Run!" Maggie yelled, shoving me in the opposite direction. We scrambled along the ledge, loose rocks showering down as the shadow pursued us. I could feel the temperature plummeting, my breath coming out in frosty puffs despite the desert heat. We rounded a corner, and Maggie suddenly pulled up short. "Oh my God," she breathed. There, in a small cave, glinted piles of gold nuggets and old mining equipment. We had stumbled upon the lost Dutchman's mine, but we had no time to process the discovery. The shadow was almost upon us, and with it came a feeling of soul-crushing dread. This thing, whatever it was, had been guarding this place for who knows how long, and it didn't want us here. Acting on instinct, I grabbed handfuls of the gold and started throwing it out of the cave, scattering it down the cliff face. "What are you doing?" Maggie yelled. "It wants the gold," I shouted back, though I had no idea how I knew that. "We have to get rid of it." Maggie joined in, and we frantically tossed handful after handful of treasure out into the gathering darkness. As the last of it disappeared over the ledge, the shadow let out another unholy shriek. The very rock around us seemed to tremble, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissipated like mist. The oppressive feeling of dread lifted. Maggie and I stood there panting, unable to believe what had just happened. We managed to find our way out of Devil's Roost as night fell. Neither of us spoke much on the hike back to the ranger station. What was there to say? We had found the legendary mine, only to give away its treasure to appease some ancient, supernatural guardian. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I even went back to search for the scattered gold, but found no trace of it. It was as if the earth had swallowed it up. Maggie and I have stayed in touch. We're the only ones who know the truth about what's out there in the Superstition Mountains. She's still looking for answers about her brother, and I find myself unable to let it go either. But we're cautious now. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, some treasures left unfound. I'll never forget that day in Devil's Roost when I came face to face with a force beyond understanding. The next time you hear a story about lost gold or cursed treasure, take my advice. Let it stay lost. Some things are better left alone. I was a successful corporate photographer in New York City, but I had grown weary of the endless grind and superficiality of that world. I yearned for something more meaningful. a chance to reconnect with nature and rediscover my passion for photography. That's what led me to pack up my gear and head out to the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. I had romantic notions of capturing breathtaking landscapes and finding artistic inspiration in the wilderness. Little did I know the horrors that awaited me in those remote woods. I arrived at the forest on a crisp autumn morning, excited to begin my adventure. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air had that sharp, clean scent that invigorates the senses. I checked in at the ranger station to get a map and some tips on the best hiking trails and scenic spots. The ranger, a friendly older man named Bill, seemed pleased to see a city girl taking an interest in nature photography. "Just be careful out there and stick to the marked trails," he advised. "It's easy to get turned around in these woods if you're not familiar with the area." I assured him I'd be cautious and headed out, my camera bag slung over my shoulder. I spent that first day happily snapping photos of the stunning vistas and fall foliage. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the small cabin I had rented as a home base for my trip. That night, as I was reviewing my photos from the day, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a rugged-looking man in his 40s standing there. He introduced himself as Jake Hayes, a seasoned outdoorsman who lived in the area. "Sorry to bother you so late," he said, "but I saw your car at the trailhead earlier and wanted to make sure you made it back okay. These woods can be dangerous for folks who don't know them well." I thanked him for his concern and assured him I was fine. We chatted for a few minutes about my photography plans, and then Jake's expression grew serious. "Listen, I know you probably think I'm just some paranoid local, but there are things in these woods that you need to watch out for," he said gravely. "Strange things that can't be explained. The natives who lived here long ago had stories about shape-shifting creatures that hunt in these forests. Most people write it off as superstition, but I've seen things out there that make me believe the legends might be true." I'll admit, I was skeptical. Jake seemed nice enough, but I figured he was just trying to scare the city girl with some spooky campfire tales. I thanked him again for stopping by and bid him good night, brushing off his warnings. The next morning, I set out early to explore a more remote area of the forest. The trail was rougher and less traveled than the main tourist paths. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, blocking out much of the sunlight. An eerie stillness settled over the forest. No birds singing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just a heavy, watchful silence. I tried to shake off my growing unease, telling myself I was just letting Jake's stories get to me. I focused on my photography, searching for the perfect shot. As I was adjusting my camera settings, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around but saw nothing there. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" No response, just that oppressive silence. I decided it was time to head back to more populated trails. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was a figure. It looked like a person, but something about its proportions seemed off. Before I could get a clear look, it ducked behind the tree and vanished. My heart pounding, I quickened my pace back down the trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling I was being watched. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Anna, Anna, wait up!" It sounded exactly like Jake. I turned, fully expecting to see him jogging up the trail behind me, but there was no one there. "Jake?" I called out hesitantly. No answer, just the wind rustling through the leaves. I broke into a run, desperate to get back to my cabin. As I ran, I heard Jake's voice again, this time coming from the woods to my left. "Anna, I'm hurt. Please help me." Every instinct screamed at me not to stop, to keep running. But what if Jake really was injured and needed help? I paused, torn with indecision. That's when I saw it step out from behind a tree about 20 feet away. It looked like Jake, almost, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs too long and joints bent at unnatural angles. Its face was Jake's, but the eyes were pitch black and utterly devoid of humanity. When it opened its mouth to speak, I saw row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "Anna," it said in Jake's voice, "don't you want to help your friend?" I ran faster than I ever have in my life. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, no longer caring about staying on the trail. All that mattered was getting away from that thing. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me, moving far faster than any human could. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main road. A passing car screeched to a halt, the driver leaning out to ask if I was okay. I babbled something about being chased and begged for a ride back to my cabin. The kind couple in the car agreed, looking concerned. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. But then it was gone. I spent a sleepless night, huddled in my cabin, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I went to the ranger station to report what had happened. To my shock, they told me Jake Hayes had been found dead in the woods that morning, his body savagely mutilated. I knew then that I had to get out of there immediately. As I was throwing my belongings in my car, another hiker approached. She introduced herself as Bethany and said she was looking for her friend who hadn't returned from a hike the day before. My blood ran cold as I realized this poor woman was about to walk into that nightmare unprepared. I made a split-second decision to stay and help Bethany search, hoping to keep her safe from the horrors I had encountered. We headed into the woods together, me on high alert for any sign of the shape-shifting creature. For hours, we searched with no sign of Bethany's missing friend. As dusk approached, I insisted we turn back. That's when we heard the scream, a woman's voice crying out in terror and pain. It was coming from deeper in the forest. "That's her," Bethany cried. "We have to help." Before I could stop her, Bethany took off running toward the sound. I chased after her, my heart pounding with fear. We burst into a small clearing, and there, in the fading light, we saw a female figure huddled on the ground. "Sarah," Bethany called out. "Oh my God, are you okay?" As Bethany rushed toward her friend, I saw the figure begin to change. Its limbs elongated grotesquely, its face melting and reforming into something inhuman. I screamed a warning, but it was too late. The creature lunged at Bethany with terrifying speed. In that moment of blind panic, I remembered something Jake had told me, that the natives used to burn sage to ward off evil spirits. I had a small bundle of dried sage in my pack that I had bought as a souvenir. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and lit it with my lighter. The pungent smoke filled the air, and to my amazement, the creature recoiled. It let out an unearthly shriek and retreated back into the shadows of the forest. Bethany and I ran for our lives, not stopping until we reached the safety of the ranger station. The authorities never found any trace of the shape-shifting monster, despite an extensive search. Bethany's friend Sarah was discovered alive 2 days later, having gotten lost and sprained her ankle. She had no memory of crying out or encountering anything strange in the woods. It's been 5 years since that horrifying experience, and I still have nightmares about what I saw in those woods. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what happened. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond human comprehension, predators that lurk in the shadows of lonely places. I no longer do nature photography. The once peaceful forests now fill me with dread. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear Jake's voice calling my name from the darkness. And I wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting and watching, ready to take on the shape of someone I trust in order to lure me to my doom. It was late October, and there was a distinct chill in the air as I set up my small tent in a clearing. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds calling, no rustling of small animals. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in around me. As darkness fell, I started a small campfire and settled in with my field notes. That's when I first noticed the strange light in the distance. At first I thought it was just the reflection of my fire on fog or mist. But as I watched, the light seemed to move and pulse with an eerie green-blue glow. Curious, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. As I moved towards the light, it retreated further into the trees. It was mesmerizing. Unlike anything I'd ever seen before, the glow seemed almost alive, shifting and swirling in unnatural patterns. Suddenly, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper carried on the wind. "Rowan, come to us, Rowan." I froze, my heart pounding. How did it know my name? I told myself I must be hearing things, that the isolation was getting to me. But then I heard it again, louder this time. "Rowan Hart, we've been waiting for you." Panic gripped me, and I turned to run back to my campsite. But in my haste, I lost my bearings. The trees all looked the same in the darkness. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, when I saw the light again. It was closer now, pulsing hypnotically. Despite my fear, I felt drawn to it. My feet started moving of their own accord, like the light was pulling me in. I tried to resist, but it was like fighting against a powerful current. As I got closer, I began to see shapes moving within the light, shadowy figures that seemed to dance and beckon. Their whispers grew louder, calling my name over and over. Just as I was about to step into the light, a sharp pain in my chest snapped me out of the trance. I looked down and saw the small stone amulet I was wearing glowing red-hot against my skin. I'd almost forgotten about it. A gift from a local woman named Nina, who I'd met in town earlier that day. Nina had warned me about strange occurrences in these woods. "The witch lights will try to lead you astray," she'd said. "This amulet will protect you, but only if your will is strong." At the time, I'd humored the old woman but didn't put much stock in her superstitions. Now, clutching the burning amulet, I realized how wrong I'd been. With tremendous effort, I tore my gaze away from the hypnotic light and ran blindly through the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear otherworldly shrieks of frustration behind me, along with the sound of something crashing through the trees in pursuit. I ran until my lungs were on fire, not daring to look back. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and onto the dirt access road where I'd parked my truck. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I sped away, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror of that unearthly green-blue glow hovering at the edge of the forest. A chill ran down my spine, as I could have sworn I saw a female figure standing there, her eyes glowing with the same eerie light. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a motel and tried to make sense of what had happened. Sleep eluded me that night as I kept replaying the events over and over. The next morning, still shaken, I decided to track down Nina to thank her and try to get some answers. But when I asked around town, no one seemed to know who I was talking about. The woman at the general store gave me an odd look when I described Nina. "Honey, There hasn't been anyone by that name living around here for at least 30 years, she said. Old Nina Blackwood passed away back in the 80s. She was known for telling wild stories about spirits in the forest. I felt the blood drain from my face. How was that possible? I'd spoken to Nina just yesterday. She'd given me the amulet that saved my life. With trembling fingers, I reached for the stone hanging around my neck. But when I looked down, it was gone, without a trace. I searched my clothes and truck frantically, but the amulet had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. That was 5 years ago, and I still can't explain what happened to me that night in Apache Sitgreaves. I've pored over scientific journals and folklore, trying to find any rational explanation. But deep down, I know I encountered something beyond the realm of science, something ancient and powerful that defies our understanding of reality. I've never returned to those woods, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, on dark nights, I swear I can still hear those whispers calling my name. And when I close my eyes, I see that hypnotic green-blue glow, still trying to draw me in. I was a forest ranger for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in Kaibab National Forest. After losing my wife Celeste to cancer last year, I felt lost and adrift. The grief was overwhelming. I needed to get away, to find some peace in nature like I used to. So I packed up my old Jeep and headed out to Kaibab, hoping the majestic ponderosa pines and crisp mountain air would soothe my aching heart. As I set up camp that first evening, the forest felt different than I remembered. The usual chorus of crickets and owls was eerily absent. An unnatural stillness hung in the air as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling as I built a small fire and heated up some canned soup for dinner. That night, I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, unable to get comfortable. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it, a woman's voice singing softly in the distance. My heart nearly stopped. It sounded exactly like Celeste, but that was impossible. Celeste was gone. I unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. The singing grew louder, echoing hauntingly through the trees. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured out to investigate. As I stumbled through the underbrush, following the otherworldly melody, a gust of icy wind extinguished my light. I fumbled to turn it back on, but it was dead. Panic started to set in as I realized I was now lost in the pitch-black forest. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, when suddenly the singing stopped. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. Then I heard it, the snap of a twig directly behind me. I whirled around and came face to face with a horrifying sight. Illuminated by an eerie green glow was the withered face of an old woman. Her skin was gray and sagging, her eyes sunken black pits. A tangle of wispy white hair floated around her head, as if underwater. She grinned at me, revealing a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. I stumbled backward with a strangled cry, tripping over a root and falling hard. When I looked up, she was gone. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping my face. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the glow of my campfire through the trees. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath. As the adrenaline faded, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night as I huddled by the fire, jumping at every snapping twig. The next morning, I hiked into the nearby town of Fredonia to stock up on supplies. As I was browsing the general store, a young woman approached me. She introduced herself as Jenny, a journalist working on a story about local legends. Apparently, she had overheard me asking the shopkeeper about strange occurrences in the forest. Jenny's eyes lit up with excitement as she asked if I'd encountered anything unusual. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy, but something about her earnest enthusiasm made me open up. I told her about the singing and the terrifying apparition I'd seen. To my surprise, Jenny didn't seem skeptical at all. She explained that she was investigating the legend of the Witch of Whispering Pines, a centuries-old tale of a woman accused of witchcraft and hanged in the forest. According to local lore, her vengeful spirit still haunted the woods, luring in unsuspecting victims. As ridiculous as it sounded, I couldn't deny that it fit with what I'd experienced. Jenny asked if she could interview me for her article. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her back at my campsite that afternoon to talk more. When Jenny arrived, we spent hours discussing the legend and my encounter. As the sun began to set, she reluctantly said she should head back to town, but just as she was about to leave, we heard it, that same haunting melody floating on the breeze. Jenny's eyes went wide. "That's it, isn't it? The witch's song?" I nodded grimly, my blood running cold. The singing grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. Tendrils of mist began creeping into our campsite, swirling around our feet. Jenny clutched my arm, her face pale with fear. Suddenly, the mist coalesced into the shape of a woman. It was her, the withered crone I'd seen the night before. But this time, her features kept shifting, sometimes appearing as the old hag, sometimes morphing into the face of my beloved Celeste. "Marcus," she crooned in Celeste's voice, "I've missed you, my love. Come to me." My heart clenched painfully. Part of me wanted so badly to believe it was really her, but I knew in my soul that this thing, whatever it was not my wife. "You're not Celeste," I growled. "Stop using her voice." The witch cackled, the sound like breaking glass. "Foolish man, I can be anyone you want me to be. I can ease your pain, take away your loneliness. Just give yourself to me." She extended a gnarled hand towards me. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to take it, to let myself be enveloped by the mist. But then I felt Jenny trembling beside me, and it snapped me back to reality. "No," I said firmly. "You have no power over me. Leave us alone." The witch's face contorted with rage. With inhuman speed, she lunged forward, clawed hands grasping for Jenny. I shoved Jenny behind me and swung my axe in a wide arc. It passed right through the witch's misty form, but she recoiled with an unearthly shriek. The mist dissipated and the witch vanished. Jenny and I stood there panting, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. After a few minutes, Jenny broke the silence. I think I should go." Her voice shook. "Thank you for saving me." I insisted on driving Jenny back to town, not wanting her to be alone in the forest. As I watched her hurry into her motel, I knew I couldn't stay in Kaibab any longer. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was far away from those whispering pines. It's been months since that terrifying encounter, but I still have nightmares about glowing green eyes and mist-wreathed claws. I've tried to convince myself it was all just a stress-induced hallucination, but deep down I know the truth. The Witch of Whispering Pines is real, and she's still out there, waiting in the shadows of the forest for her next victim. So if you're ever hiking in Kaibab and hear a woman singing in the distance, whatever you do, don't follow the song. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because once she gets her claws in you, she'll never let go. I grew up hearing stories about the lost Dutchman's mine in the Superstition Mountains. As a kid, I was fascinated by the legends of hidden gold and mysterious disappearances, but I never imagined I'd have my own terrifying encounter out there. It started as a solo camping trip last summer. I'd been feeling stuck in my life and thought getting away to explore the mountains might help clear my head. Plus, I'll admit part of me still harbored that childhood dream of stumbling upon the legendary mine. I packed my gear and headed out early on a Saturday morning. The drive from Phoenix took about an hour, winding through saguaro-studded desert before reaching the rugged Superstition wilderness. I parked at the Peralta trailhead, shouldered my heavy pack, and set off into the stark beauty of the mountains. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The June heat was intense, but I carried plenty of water and took frequent breaks in whatever scraps of shade I could find. By mid-afternoon, I'd climbed high enough to get some impressive views of the surrounding peaks and valleys. I decided to veer off the main trail and explore a less-traveled area known as Devil's Roost. In hindsight, the ominous name should have been a warning, but at the time I was caught up in the thrill of adventure. As I picked my way through a boulder-strewn wash, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I scanned the rocky slopes around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, an eerie stillness had settled over the landscape. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the creepy feeling and pressed on. But with each step, my unease grew. The afternoon shadows seemed to deepen and shift in unnatural ways. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. Just as I was seriously considering turning back, I came across another hiker, a woman who introduced herself as Maggie Porter. She explained that she was a forest ranger out searching for her brother, who had gone missing in the area a few weeks prior while investigating the lost Dutchman legend. I hesitated to tell Maggie about the weird vibes I'd been getting, not wanting to sound like a paranoid lunatic. But as we talked, she admitted to experiencing similar phenomena: unexplained noises, equipment malfunctions, and a pervasive sense of being stalked by something just out of sight. We decided to team up and make camp for the night, figuring there was safety in numbers. As darkness fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The fire we built seemed to barely penetrate the inky blackness surrounding us. Several times we both heard what sounded like footsteps circling our campsite, but our flashlights revealed nothing. I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams filled with shadowy figures and echoing whispers. I awoke at dawn feeling drained and on edge. Maggie looked equally unsettled. We broke camp quickly and continued our exploration, sticking close together. As we hiked, Maggie filled me in on some of the darker aspects of the lost Dutchman legend, stories of a curse placed on the gold by Apache spirits and of a malevolent entity that guarded the mine's location. I was skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't deny that something felt very wrong in these mountains. The day grew oppressively hot, yet I felt a persistent chill. My phone and GPS unit began glitching, the screens flickering with strange symbols before dying completely. By mid-morning, we'd reached a narrow box canyon that Maggie thought might lead to the mine's location. As we made our way deeper into the shadowy confines, that skin-crawling sensation of being watched intensified tenfold. Suddenly, Maggie let out a strangled gasp. Following her gaze, I saw a dark figure standing on a ledge above us. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but seemed to be composed of writhing shadows. As we stared in horror, It began to move toward us with a liquid, inhuman grace. We turned and ran, stumbling over loose rocks in our panic. The sound of pursuit was right behind us, a susurrating whisper like sand shifting in the wind. I chanced to look back and immediately wished I hadn't. The shadow entity had grown, towering over us and seeming to absorb the very light around it. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst out of the canyon into a small clearing, and there, half buried in the rusty soil, was a glint of yellow, gold nuggets, scattered around what looked like the collapsed entrance to an old mine. For a split-second, wonder overcame my fear. Could this actually be the legendary Lost Dutchman's mine? But that moment of awe was shattered as the shadow creature materialized at the edge of the clearing, its form twisting and roiling. A bone-deep certainty seized me then. This thing, whatever it was the guardian of the mine, and it would never let us leave with knowledge of its location. In that moment of clarity, I knew what I had to do. I frantically began scooping handfuls of dirt over the gold, burying it once more. Maggie quickly caught on and joined me. We worked with desperate speed as the shadow edged closer, the air growing frigid around us. Just as the last nugget disappeared beneath the soil, the entity let out an otherworldly shriek that sent us to our knees. The ground bucked and heaved. Rocks tumbled down the canyon walls. I was sure we were about to be swallowed up by the earth itself. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The shaking stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like a heavy blanket being pulled away. I looked up to find the shadow creature had vanished, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Maggie and I didn't stick around to see if it would return. We hightailed it out of there, not stopping until we reached the trailhead hours later. We were scratched, bruised, and utterly shell-shocked, but alive. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by heat and exhaustion. But I knew deep down that we had encountered something beyond rational explanation. I've never gone back to the Superstition Mountains, and I don't plan to. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some treasures better left buried. I don't know if what we found was really the Lost Dutchman's mine, but I do know that there are forces in this world that we can't begin to understand. Ancient, powerful things that don't take kindly to being disturbed. So, if you're ever hiking out in the superstitions and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like something's watching from the shadows, my advice is to turn around and get out of there fast. Some legends are best left as just that, legends. Now, in the light of day, I could finally take in my surroundings. Towering ponderosa pines, stretched as far as the eye could see, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. Solitude, nature, a chance to clear my head and figure out my next steps. I made myself a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, then decided to take a short hike to explore the area. The Forest Service map showed a trail not far from where I'd parked, so I grabbed my day pack and set off. At first, everything seemed normal. The trail was well maintained, winding between massive tree trunks and patches of wild grass. I could hear squirrels chattering and birds calling in the distance. But as I walked deeper into the forest, a subtle uneasiness began to creep over me. It was hard to put my finger on exactly what felt off, but something just wasn't quite right. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, there and gone before I could focus on them. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my imagination was just running wild after months of stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the warm sun overhead. Deciding I'd gone far enough, I turned to head back to my RV. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trail I'd been following had disappeared. Where there should have been a clear path, there was now only dense underbrush. I spun in a circle, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. Somehow, in the span of just a few minutes, I'd become completely turned around. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. Of course not. I was in the middle of nowhere. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. All I had to do was retrace my steps. I'd find my way back eventually. But as I started walking, things only got stranger. The forest seemed to shift and change around me. Trees that I could have sworn weren't there before suddenly loomed in my path. Clearings appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. At one point, I found myself face to face with a sheer rock wall that I knew for certain hadn't been there moments ago. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and I was growing desperate. I called out for help, my voice echoing eerily through the trees. And then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. But it came again, a little louder this time. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that didn't sound quite human. I spun around wildly, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Hello?" I shouted. "Is someone there? I need help." The whispering grew louder, coming from all directions at once. It was joined by other noises, rustling leaves, creaking branches, what sounded like footsteps circling around me. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about finding the trail. I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. As I ran, the forest seemed to come alive around me. Branches whipped at my face, and roots rose up to trip me. The very ground beneath my feet felt like it was shifting and undulating. The whispers had become a cacophony, filling my head until I could barely think. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish place. Finally, I burst out of the trees into a small clearing and fell to my knees, gasping for breath. As I knelt there, trying to get my bearings, I slowly became aware of a presence behind me. Every instinct screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin seemed to ripple and shift, blending in with the bark of the trees around it. And its face, God, its face. Where there should have been features, there was only a swirling void, like a black hole had opened up where its head should be. I scrambled backwards, a scream caught in my throat. The thing took a step forward, moving with a fluidity that defied physics. As it moved, the very fabric of reality seemed to warp around it. Trees bent impossibly, the ground rippled like water, and the air itself seemed to twist and distort. In that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that this forest was far more than just a collection of trees. It was alive, conscious, and utterly alien, and it had been toying with me, herding me deeper into its domain for some unknowable purpose. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I lurched to my feet and ran. I had no idea which direction I was going, but it didn't matter. I just had to get away. Behind me, I could hear the forest come alive with sounds of pursuit. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and always there was that awful whispering, growing louder and more frenzied. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I caught a glimpse of something metallic through the trees. My RV. Somehow, against all odds, I'd made it back. I put on a final burst of speed and all but threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. For a long moment, I just stood there, trembling and gasping for breath. Then slowly, hesitantly, I approached the window and peered out. The forest looked normal again, peaceful even. There was no sign of the horrors I'd just experienced. If it weren't for my racing heart and the scratches covering my arms and face, I might have thought it was all a vivid hallucination. I didn't wait around to see if the calm would last. I fired up the RV's engine and got the hell out of there, driving through the night until I was far, far away from Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. It's been weeks now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of inhuman whispers echoing in my ears. I've tried to convince myself that it was all just a stress-induced breakdown, that none of it was real, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, ancient and powerful beings that view us as little more than playthings. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we stumble into their domain. I don't know why the forest let me go that day. Maybe it was just toying with me, or maybe I simply wasn't what it was looking for. But I do know this: I'll never set foot in those woods again. And if you value your sanity, neither should you. Some places are not meant for human eyes, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was late January, and we were in the midst of a particularly brutal winter. The snow had been falling steadily for days, piling up in massive drifts. That evening the wind really started to pick up, howling and rattling the windows. Emily and I were curled up by the fireplace, listening to the storm rage outside, when we heard a strange scratching sound at the front door. At first I thought it was just a tree branch scraping against the house, but then came a plaintive whining noise. I opened the door to find a fox huddled on our porch, shivering violently. Without hesitation, I scooped up the poor creature and brought it inside. Emily quickly grabbed some towels and we dried off its matted fur. The fox was clearly terrified, its eyes wide and darting around frantically. We had barely gotten the fox settled when we heard more noises outside. I peered out the window to see several deer stumbling through the deep snow towards our house, followed by a family of raccoons. They all looked panicked, as if fleeing from some unseen threat. "What in the world is going on?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years in Vermont, I'd never seen wildlife behave like this. One by one, we let the animals in: deer, raccoons, even a few rabbits and squirrels. They huddled together in our living room, still agitated but seeming to take some comfort in the warmth and shelter. The storm continued to intensify, the wind now a deafening roar. Suddenly there was a thunderous crash from the back of the house. We ran to investigate and found that a massive oak tree had toppled, narrowly missing our bedroom. As we stood there in shock, we heard a low, pained growl. My blood ran cold as I saw an enormous black bear limping out of the woods. Its fur was matted with blood, and one of its legs was clearly broken. The bear dragged itself towards our house, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. It collapsed just feet from our back door, its labored breathing visible in the frigid air. I wanted to help, but I knew it was far too dangerous to approach an injured bear. We could only watch helplessly as the creature's breathing grew weaker and weaker. After what felt like hours, the bear let out one final, mournful growl before going still. Emily was sobbing quietly beside me. I put my arm around her, trying to offer comfort even as my own mind reeled. What could have driven all these animals to flee in terror? What could have injured a full-grown bear so severely? We retreated back inside, double-checking that all the doors and windows were securely locked. The animals we'd taken in were unnaturally quiet now, huddled together and trembling. Even our own cats and dog, usually so rambunctious, were hiding under furniture and whimpering softly. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind shrieked and howled, rattling the entire house. Tree branches lashed against the windows like gnarled fingers, trying to claw their way in. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. Around 3 a.m., just when I thought things couldn't get any more unsettling, we heard it. A voice carried on the wind, calling out from somewhere in the swirling snow. "Let me in," it said, barely audible above the storm. "Please, let me in." Emily gripped my arm tightly. "Luke, did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We waited, straining our ears. A few moments later it came again. "I'm so cold, please, open the door, let me in." The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to shift and change with each word, sometimes sounding like a child, then an old woman, then a man. There was an otherworldly quality to it that made my skin crawl. "Don't answer it," Emily pleaded. "Whatever it is, don't let it in." I had no intention of opening that door. Every instinct I had was screaming that this thing, whatever it was dangerous. The voice continued calling out, growing more insistent with each plea. The animals in our living room became more agitated, whimpering and pacing nervously. Our dog started growling, his hackles raised. "I can see you in there," the voice said, a hint of menace creeping in. "I know you can hear me. Open the door. Let me in." I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to do just that, to walk to the door and fling it open wide. My legs actually started moving of their own accord before I snapped out of it. Emily was tugging on my arm, tears streaming down her face as she begged me not to go near the door. The voice grew angry then, no longer bothering to sound human. It became a guttural growl, punctuated by inhuman shrieks that made my ears ring. The animals in our house went berserk, the deer kicking and thrashing, the smaller creatures scrambling to hide. Our windows began to rattle more violently, as if something massive was throwing itself against the house. I saw long, dark shadows moving just beyond the glass, cast by no earthly source of light. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath suddenly visible in the air. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but may have only been minutes. Just when I thought our sanity or the house's foundations would give way, everything stopped. The voice fell silent. The shadows retreated. The storm itself seemed to lose some of its fury. Emily and I clung to each other, shaking uncontrollably. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. We simply waited, dreading the thing's return, until the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. When morning finally came, we found no trace of the horrors from the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene blanket of pristine snow. The animals we'd sheltered were calm now. We opened the door, and they filed out peacefully, disappearing back into the woods. The only evidence anything strange had occurred was the body of the bear, half buried in the snow behind our house. But even that seemed less menacing in the light of day, just a tragic casualty of a harsh winter storm. I wanted so badly to believe it had all been some sort of shared hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew what we'd experienced was all too real. In the weeks that followed, I found myself plagued by nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the voice from that night echoing in my head. I became jumpy and irritable, starting at every unexpected sound. Emily tried to get me to talk about it, but I shut down every time she brought it up. I couldn't bear to relive that terror. About a month after that night, it happened. I was at work when suddenly the left side of my body went numb. My vision blurred and I couldn't form words properly. By the time the ambulance arrived, I had collapsed. The doctors called it a massive stroke, highly unusual for someone my age with no prior health issues. They ran test after test, but could find no clear cause. I spent weeks in the hospital, slowly regaining some function, but the damage was permanent. The entire left side of my body remained partially paralyzed. My speech was slurred and halting. I struggled with basic tasks that I'd once taken for granted. Emily has been my rock through it all, patiently helping me with physical therapy and relearning everyday skills. But I can see the toll it's taken on her. She blames herself sometimes, wondering if she could have done something differently that night. I try to tell her it's not her fault, but the words don't come out right. The truth is, I don't know why this happened to me, but in my heart, I'm certain it's connected to whatever sinister force was out there in the storm that night. Sometimes I think I was lucky. That thing could have taken my life instead of just my health. Other times, in my darker moments, I wonder if death might have been preferable to this half-life I'm now living. I've never been able to fully explain to Emily or the doctors what I saw in those final moments before my stroke. The memory is hazy, like a half-forgotten nightmare. But I have a vague recollection of a tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its malevolent gaze boring into me. As my vision faded and my body betrayed me, I heard that familiar voice one last time. I told you to let me in. Now, years later, I still find myself lying awake at night, listening for that voice on the wind. Emily says I'm being paranoid, that we're safe. But I know the truth. That thing is still out there somewhere, and one day it might come back to finish what it started. I was always the outdoorsy type, loved nothing more than getting away from the hustle and bustle of city life to spend a few days roughing it in nature. My cousin Cody shared that passion, so we'd often plan camping trips together in the summer. This particular trip was supposed to be a relaxing long weekend in Arapahoe Forest out in Colorado. Man, how wrong we were about that. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, just a light breeze rustling through the pines. As we set up our tents and got a fire going, I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. The chirping of birds, the babbling of a nearby stream, the fresh scent of pine needles. It was idyllic. That first evening passed uneventfully. We grilled some burgers over the fire, cracked open a few beers, and spent hours just shooting the breeze and catching up. It had been a while since Cody and I had a chance to really hang out, so we were making the most of it. As night fell, we kept the fire burning, and Cody pulled out his guitar. He strummed away as we swapped stories and jokes late into the night. It must have been close to midnight when we first heard it, a faint whistling sound coming from somewhere in the darkened forest around us. At first I didn't think much of it. Could have been the wind or some nocturnal bird. But as the minutes ticked by, the whistling grew closer and more distinct. It had a melody to it, haunting and slightly off-key. I glanced at Cody and saw the confused look on his face. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly, setting his guitar aside. We fell silent, straining our ears. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Someone, or something, was walking near our campsite. "Hello?" Cody called out tentatively. "Anyone there?" No response, just more footsteps circling our little clearing. My heart was pounding now. I tried to rationalize it. Probably just another camper out for a late-night stroll. But if that was the case, why weren't they answering? "Maybe we should pack up and head out," I suggested nervously. But Cody shook his head. "Nah, man, it's pitch black out there. We'd never find our way back to the car. Let's just keep an eye out. I'm sure it's nothing." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, agreeing to keep alert for any other strange noises. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me bolt upright in my sleeping bag. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when a sound jolted me awake. My eyes flew open, heart racing as I tried to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it again, a zipper being slowly, carefully opened. The zipper to my tent. I lay there frozen in terror as moonlight spilled into the tent. A shadow fell across the opening, blocking out the silvery light. Someone was standing there, peering inside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was rigid with fear as I stared at the silhouette framed in the tent flap. It was too dark to make out any features, just a vague human shape. But I could feel eyes on me, studying me in the darkness. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the figure stood motionless, watching. My mind raced through all the horrible possibilities of what might happen next. Would they attack? Drag me out of the tent? Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, the shadow moved. Slowly, silently, the zipper was pulled back down. Footsteps crunched away from my tent, fading into the night. I lay there for what felt like hours, ears straining for any further sounds, afraid to even twitch a muscle. Eventually, the sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. Only then did I finally gather the courage to emerge from my tent. The campsite looked undisturbed. No sign of an intruder, no footprints or other evidence of the nighttime visitor. If it weren't for the lingering dread in the pit of my stomach, I might have convinced myself it was all just a vivid nightmare. I made my way over to Cody's tent on shaky legs. "Cody!" I hissed, unzipping his tent flap. "Cody, wake up." He groaned and rolled over, blinking at me blearily. "What's up? It's barely light out." "We need to leave, now." I quickly filled him in on what had happened during the night. To my dismay, he seemed skeptical. "Are you sure you weren't just dreaming, man? I didn't hear anything weird after we went to bed." "I'm telling you, someone was here. They opened my tent and were watching me sleep." My voice was rising in pitch, edged with hysteria. Cody held up his hands placatingly. Okay, look, even if someone was snooping around, they're gone now. We're fine. No reason to freak out and bail on the whole trip." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could he be so nonchalant about this? "Are you insane? We need to get out of here before they come back." But Cody wouldn't budge. He was convinced I'd just had a particularly vivid nightmare brought on by the creepy noises we'd heard earlier. No amount of arguing on my part could persuade him otherwise. In the end, we stayed. The day passed tensely, at least for me. I jumped at every sound, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Cody tried to lighten the mood, suggesting hikes or fishing, but I refused to stray far from the campsite. As evening approached, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The thought of spending another night out here was unbearable. I pleaded with Cody one last time to pack up and leave, but he remained stubbornly set on staying the full weekend as planned. "Look," he said, exasperated, "if it'll make you feel better, I'll stay up and keep watch tonight. You can get some sleep and see that there's nothing to worry about." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I reluctantly agreed, crawling into my tent as the sun began to set. Despite my exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. I tossed and turned, straining my ears for any hint of the whistling or footsteps from the night before. Hours crept by. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of wind through the trees. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, the zipper of Cody's tent slowly opening. My blood ran cold. Cody was supposed to be keeping watch. Why would he be getting in his tent? Unless... With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight and phone. The beam illuminated the inside of my tent as I frantically dialed 911. But before I could hit call, a shadow fell across the tent wall. The same silhouette from the night before was there, motionless, watching. I bit back a scream. Every muscle in my body clenched in terror. The shadow seemed to grow larger, leaning in closer to the tent. Just as I was certain the mysterious figure was about to unzip my tent, a shout rang out. "Hey, who's out there?" It was Cody's voice. The shadow jerked back, startled. Heavy footsteps pounded away from the campsite as Cody continued yelling. I burst out of my tent to find Cody standing by the remains of our campfire, flashlight in hand, peering into the darkness. "Did you see them?" I gasped. "Which way did they go?" Cody shook his head, looking shaken. "I just caught a glimpse of someone skulking around your tent. Couldn't make out any details. They took off running as soon as I yelled." We spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, jumping at every sound. As soon as there was enough light to see, we broke camp in record time and hightailed it out of there. To this day, I have no idea who our mysterious visitor was or what they wanted. Was it just some creep getting their kicks scaring campers, or something more sinister? I'll never know for sure, but one thing's for certain. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Some experiences change you forever, and that nightmarish trip opened my eyes to the very real dangers that can be lurking in the wilderness. I was never close to my dad. He was always a distant figure, more interested in his work than in spending time with me. So when he passed away suddenly last month, I was surprised to learn that he had left me his old cabin near Mount Bachelor in Oregon. I hadn't even known he owned property out there. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the place. I live in Portland and didn't have much interest in maintaining a remote cabin I'd never even seen before. But after a few weeks of feeling lost and adrift following the funeral, I decided that maybe getting away for a bit would do me some good. My job was flexible enough that I could work remotely for a while, so I packed up my laptop and some supplies and made the drive out to Bend with my dog Midnight. The cabin was tucked away at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by dense pine forest. As I pulled up, I had to admit the setting was beautiful. Pristine snow blanketing everything, icicles hanging from the eaves, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Wait, smoke? That was odd, since the place had been empty for weeks. I cautiously approached the front door, Midnight padding along beside me. The door was locked. and when I used the key I'd been given, I found the cabin dark and cold inside. No sign of any recent visitors or fires in the wood stove. Must have just been my imagination. I spent that first afternoon settling in, unpacking my gear and exploring the cozy two-room cabin. It was simply furnished, but had all the basic amenities. A small kitchen, a living area with a sofa and wood stove, and a loft bedroom accessible by ladder. Best of all was the large picture window with a stunning view of snowy forest sloping down to a half-frozen lake. As evening fell, I got a fire going in the wood stove and settled onto the sofa with my laptop to catch up on some work emails. Midnight curled up at my feet, and for a while everything felt peaceful. But as the hours ticked by, I started to get an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. Every time I glanced up at the dark window, I half expected to see a face peering in, but there was never anything there. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and head up to the loft to sleep. I was just about to climb the ladder when Midnight suddenly lifted his head and growled softly, staring intently at the front door. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. Midnight just kept growling, and then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside, circling around the cabin. My heart began to race. Who the hell could be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I quickly turned off all the lights and peered out the window, straining to see in the darkness. The full moon provided some illumination, casting long shadows across the snowy clearing. And that's when I saw them, a set of tracks in the snow, leading right up to the cabin and then circling around it. But these weren't human footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, with strange claw-like protrusions at the toes. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. What kind of animal could leave tracks like that? A bear, maybe? But bears should be hibernating this time of year, and the tracks looked wrong somehow, almost like a parody of human footprints. Midnight was still growling softly, hackles raised as he stared at the door. I heard more crunching sounds like something heavy moving through the snow, and then a loud thump on the roof directly above me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Hello?" I called out, hating how shaky my voice sounded. "Is someone there?" No response, just more thumping sounds moving across the roof. It sounded like something was walking up there, something big. I grabbed a fireplace poker and moved to the center of the room, my eyes darting between the door, the windows, and the ceiling. Midnight pressed against my leg, still growling. The thumps continued for another minute, then suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell over the cabin. I stood there frozen, straining my ears for any sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft scraping noise. It was coming from the chimney. Oh God, was something trying to come down the chimney? I edged closer to the wood stove, poker raised. The scraping got louder, accompanied by an odd chittering sound that made my skin crawl. Midnight suddenly barked loudly, making me jump, but the sound seemed to startle whatever was in the chimney. The scraping noises ceased abruptly. I don't know how long I stood there, muscles tense, waiting for something to happen. But eventually the adrenaline started to wear off and exhaustion set in. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, weak morning sunlight was filtering through the windows. I rubbed my eyes, momentarily disoriented. Had it all been a nightmare? But no. There was Midnight still on alert by the door, and when I looked out the window, I could clearly see those massive, claw-tipped tracks circling the cabin. I spent the morning in a daze, trying to convince myself there must be a rational explanation. Maybe it was just some elaborate prank by the locals. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something seriously wrong here. I tried to distract myself with work, but I couldn't focus. By early afternoon, cabin fever was setting in hard. I decided Midnight and I needed some fresh air and exercise. We set out to explore the woods a bit, being careful to stay within sight of the cabin. That's when things got even weirder. As we walked along the tree line, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, about 50 yards away, was a bizarrely tall, thin figure standing perfectly still next to a massive pine tree. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with gangly limbs and what looked like patchy, matted fur covering its body. I froze, not daring to move. The creature's head slowly swiveled towards me. I couldn't make out any facial features at that distance, but I had the distinct impression it was staring right at me. Midnight started whining and tugging at his leash, clearly wanting to get back to the cabin. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, dragging Midnight along with me. I swear I could feel eyes boring into my back the whole way. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and sank to the floor, heart pounding. What the hell had I just seen? The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. I kept all the curtains drawn and jumped at every little sound. As night fell, the atmosphere of dread intensified. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel a malevolent presence out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Around 9 p.m., the noises started again. Footsteps in the snow, scratching at the walls, that horrible chittering sound. But this time, there was something new, a voice. It was faint and distorted, like it was coming from very far away, but I could just make out words. "Come outside. Come play with us." I shuddered and clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice seemed to be inside my head somehow. "Your father is here. He wants to see you." I felt a sob catch in my throat. "No," I whispered. "You're not real. This isn't happening." But it kept going, cajoling and threatening by turns, promising wonderful things if I just opened the door, and horrible fates if I didn't. I curled into a ball on the sofa, shaking. Midnight huddled close, whimpering softly. I don't know how long it went on. Hours, probably. I was on the verge of a complete breakdown when suddenly a memory surfaced. Something my dad had told me years ago, one of the few times we'd actually talked. He'd said that if I was ever in real trouble, the kind of trouble you can't explain or deal with rationally, the most important thing was to stay inside. Don't open the door for anything. He'd been so serious when he said it, so intent on making sure I understood. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as if triggered by the memory, the voice suddenly changed. It wasn't the sickly sweet cajoling tone anymore. Now it was angry, demanding. "Open the door! Let us in!" The whole cabin shook with the force of something huge slamming against the walls. The windows rattled in their frames, but I grit my teeth and stayed put. No matter what, I wouldn't open that door. I must have passed out at some point from sheer exhaustion. When I came to, pale dawn light was creeping through the curtains. The oppressive atmosphere from the night before had lifted. Somehow, I knew the danger had passed. At least for now. I went to the window and peeked out. The clearing was empty and still. No tracks in the snow, no sign of the tall creature I'd seen. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I packed up my things, got Midnight in the car, and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back since. I've tried to convince myself it was all just stress and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something evil lives in those woods. And somehow, my dad knew about it. I have so many questions now that I'll never get answers to. But one thing's for sure, I'm going to follow his advice. I'm staying far away from that cabin, and I'm never opening the door. I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace one evening, looking for a good deal on a used iPhone. My current phone was on its last legs, and I needed an upgrade, but didn't want to shell out for a brand new device. That's when I came across a listing for an iPhone 13 Pro that seemed almost too good to be true. It was priced way below market value, and the seller claimed it was in perfect condition. I messaged the seller, a guy named Melvin, to ask if it was still available. He responded quickly, and we started chatting about the phone. Everything seemed legit at first. He answered my questions about the specs and condition, and even sent me some additional photos. We agreed on a price and arranged to meet up the next day to complete the sale. I told my friend Martina about the great deal I'd found, and she offered to come with me to meet the seller. You can never be too careful with these online transactions, she said. I was grateful for the company, and we made plans to go together after work. The next day, Martina picked me up, and we headed to the meeting spot Melvin had suggested, the parking lot of a local grocery store. It was around 6 p.m. and still light out, so I felt pretty safe. But when we got there, Melvin was nowhere to be found. I texted him to let him know we had arrived. A few minutes later, I got a message back. Sorry, something came up. Can we meet at the gas station on 5th Street instead? I was a little annoyed at the last-minute change, but figured it wasn't a big deal. Martina and I drove over to the new location. We waited in the gas station parking lot for about 10 minutes, but Melvin still didn't show. I was starting to get frustrated when another text came through. My car won't start. Can you come to my place instead? I live just off Route 9. At this point, alarm bells started going off in my head. Why did he keep changing the location? And now he wanted us to come to his house? It seemed sketchy. I showed Martina the messages, and she agreed it was suspicious. Let's give him one more chance, I said. We'll tell him to meet us at the McDonald's by the highway. It's public and well lit. If he changes it again, we're out. I messaged Melvin with the new location. He agreed, but something about his tone seemed off. My gut was telling me this whole thing was a bad idea, but I really wanted that phone. Against my better judgment, we decided to go to McDonald's and see what happened. We got there around 7:30 p.m. The sun was starting to set, and the restaurant was pretty quiet. We went inside and got a table near the window so we could keep an eye on the parking lot. I texted Melvin to let him know we were there. 20 tense minutes passed with no sign of him. I was about ready to call the whole thing off when a beat-up old sedan pulled into the lot. A scruffy-looking guy got out and glanced around furtively before heading towards the entrance. My heart started racing. Was this Melvin? He looked nothing like his profile picture. As he came through the door, his eyes locked onto us, and he made a beeline for our table. Martina gripped my arm, clearly as freaked out as I was. The guy slid into the booth across from us. Up close, he looked even sketchier. Greasy hair, bloodshot eyes, dirty clothes. He didn't say a word, just stared at us with an unsettling intensity. After an uncomfortable silence, I cleared my throat. Are you Melvin? He nodded slowly. You got the money? I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. But before I could respond, he spoke again. Actually, I left the phone in my car. Come with me and I'll show it to you. That was it. All pretense of this being a legitimate sale evaporated. I stammered out some excuse about needing to use the bathroom and practically dragged Martina with me towards the back of the restaurant. As soon as we were out of sight, I whispered urgently, We need to get out of here, now. Martina nodded, her face pale. There's an emergency exit by the bathrooms. Let's go. We pushed through the door and found ourselves in the back parking lot. I could hear the sound of footsteps coming from inside. He was following us. Panic rising in my chest, we sprinted to Martina's car. Just as we were about to reach it, I heard a shout behind us. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" I risked a glance back and saw Melvin bursting out of the emergency exit, his face contorted with rage. He was holding something in his hand. Was that a knife? Adrenaline surging, we practically dove into the car. Martina fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. I kept my eyes on Melvin, who was getting closer by the second. Come on, I muttered desperately as Martina struggled to start the engine. Just as Melvin reached the car, it roared to life. Martina slammed it into reverse, and we peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching. I twisted around in my seat to look behind us. Melvin was standing in the lot, watching us drive away. The look on his face made my blood run cold. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, both of us too shaken to speak. Finally, Martina let out a shaky breath. What the hell just happened? I shook my head, still trying to process it all. I don't know, but I think we just narrowly escaped being robbed, or worse. We decided to head to a busy shopping center about 20 minutes away, figuring we'd be safe in a crowded public place. As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt myself starting to relax a little. We were okay. We had gotten away. Martina suggested we go into the Applebee's to calm our nerves and figure out what to do next. I agreed, thinking a drink sounded pretty good right about then. We got a table and ordered some food and drinks, trying to laugh off our scary experience. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing around the restaurant, half expecting to see Melvin's face in the crowd. About halfway through our meal, I got up to use the restroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror and froze. There, reflected in the glass, was Melvin. He was sitting at the bar, staring directly at me. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. How had he found us? Had he followed us this whole time? I rushed back to our table, trying to keep my voice calm as I told Martina what I'd seen. Her eyes widened in fear. We need to leave, now. We hastily paid our bill and practically ran to the car. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Melvin emerge from the restaurant, watching us drive away. "He's following us," Martina said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I turned to look out the back window, and sure enough, I could see headlights gaining on us. "Take the highway," I said. "Maybe we can lose him." Martina merged onto the interstate, pushing the speed limit. But the headlights behind us kept pace. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should we call the police? Try to make it to a police station? Suddenly, Martina cursed. "The gas light just came on. We're almost empty." Panic clawed at my throat. We were in the middle of nowhere, on a dark stretch of highway, being chased by a potentially dangerous stranger, and about to run out of gas. This couldn't be happening. "There's an exit coming up," I said, peering at the signs. "Let's get off and find a gas station." Martina took the exit, the headlights still close behind. We found ourselves on a quiet country road, surrounded by dark fields. The only sign of civilization was a small gas station about a half-mile ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the darkness. As we pulled up to the pump, I saw the headlights that had been following us continue past the exit. Had we lost him? I let out a shaky breath, feeling a glimmer of hope. Martina got out to pump the gas while I kept watch. The station was deserted except for a bored-looking attendant inside. Every shadow, every rustle of wind made me jump. Just as Martina finished filling up, a car pulled into the station. My heart stopped as I recognized Melvin's beat-up sedan. How had he found us again? "Get in the car," I yelled to Martina. She saw what I was looking at and leapt into the driver's seat. We peeled out of the station just as Melvin was getting out of his car. Martina drove like a woman possessed, taking random turns down country roads in an attempt to lose our pursuer. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see any headlights behind us. After about 20 minutes of frantic driving, we finally felt safe enough to slow down. We were completely lost, surrounded by farmland with no idea which direction would take us back to the highway. "I think we lost him," Martina said, her voice trembling with leftover adrenaline. I nodded, slumping back in my seat. The fear and stress of the night caught up with me all at once, and I felt utterly drained. We drove aimlessly for a while, trying to find our bearings. Finally, we spotted a sign for the interstate and breathed a collective sigh of relief. We were almost home. As we merged onto the highway, I felt the last of the tension leave my body. We had made it. We were safe, but our relief was short-lived. About 5 miles down the road, the car suddenly started to shake violently. Martina gripped the wheel, trying to maintain control as she guided us onto the shoulder. "What's happening?" I asked, fear creeping back into my voice. Martina shook her head, looking bewildered. "I don't know. It feels like a flat tire." We got out to investigate, using our phone flashlights to examine the tires. Sure enough, the rear driver's side tire was completely flat. But as I leaned in for a closer look, I realized with horror that this was no ordinary flat. The tire had been cleanly slashed. My blood ran cold as the implications sank in. Melvin must have done this while we were in Applebee's. He had been toying with us this whole time, knowing our escape would be short-lived. I opened my mouth to tell Martina what I'd found, but before I could speak, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. They were moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something or someone. Martina saw it too. Without a word, we both scrambled back into the car and locked the doors. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. All we could do was sit there in the dark, watching those headlights get closer and closer, wondering if this night of terror was about to reach its terrifying climax. "We'll be back soon, sweetie," my mom had said, kissing me on the forehead. "Just stay in bed and go to sleep. We'll check on you when we get home." I remember lying in bed, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling. The house felt so empty and quiet without my family there. Every little creak and groan of the old floorboards made me jump. I tried to close my eyes and drift off to sleep, but I was too anxious. It must have been around midnight when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the front door slowly creaking open. My heart started pounding. Had my parents come home already? But why would they be opening the door so slowly and quietly? I strained my ears, listening intently. There were footsteps downstairs, moving cautiously across the living room. They didn't sound like my parents' familiar footsteps at all. These were slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying not to make any noise. Panic gripped me as I realized what was happening. Someone had broken into our house. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but terror paralyzed me. I lay frozen in my bed, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps continued, moving from room to room downstairs. I could hear drawers being opened, things being moved around. Occasionally, there was a soft thud or clink of something being set down. The intruder seemed to be searching for valuables. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling in fear as the stranger prowled through our home. It felt like hours. Eventually, the footsteps started coming up the stairs. My room was at the end of the hallway. I squeezed my eyes shut and silently prayed that they wouldn't come in. The floorboards in the hall creaked as the intruder moved closer and closer to my room. I could hear their breathing now, low and raspy. My door slowly opened with an agonizing squeak. I wanted to disappear, to sink into my mattress and vanish, but I couldn't move a muscle. I lay there, eyes clenched shut, hardly breathing, as someone entered my room. The footsteps approached my bed. I could sense the intruder looming over me, could feel their presence like a heavy weight pressing down. The raspy breathing was right above me now. I've never been so terrified in my life. I was certain I was about to be grabbed, or worse. But after what felt like an eternity, the intruder moved away. I heard them rummaging through my dresser drawers, opening my closet. Finally, mercifully, they left my room. I heard them continue down the hall, checking the other bedrooms. More drawers opening and closing, more soft thuds and clinks. I don't know how long the ordeal lasted. It felt like hours, but it may have only been 30 minutes or so. Eventually, I heard the intruder's footsteps going back downstairs. The front door opened and closed. Then silence. I lay there for a long time, afraid to move, afraid it had been a trick and the intruder was still in the house. But gradually I began to relax as the silence stretched on. When I finally found the courage to get out of bed, my legs were shaking so badly I could hardly stand. I crept downstairs, flicking on every light as I went. The house was a mess. Drawers pulled out, cabinets left open, various items strewn about. But nothing seemed to be missing as far as I could tell. It was as if the intruder had just been looking for something or someone. I huddled on the couch, every light in the house blazing, until my parents finally came home around 3 a.m. They found me in tears, barely able to speak. When I managed to tell them what happened, they were horrified. They called the police right away. The police searched the house but found no sign of forced entry. Because the front door had been left unlocked, they said there wasn't much they could do. No fingerprints were found. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. My parents were racked with guilt for leaving me alone and forgetting to lock up. They installed a security system the very next day. But the damage was already done. I couldn't sleep alone for months after that. Even now, decades later, I triple-check that all the doors and windows are locked every night. The strange thing is, nothing was ever taken from our house. The intruder hadn't stolen any valuables or electronics. They had just looked around, gone through our things, come into my room and stood over my bed. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was just some vivid nightmare brought on by being left alone. But then I remember the tangible feeling of dread as those footsteps approached my room. The sound of that raspy breathing above me. It was all too real. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. Who was in our house? What were they looking for? Why did they come into my room and stand over my bed, but not harm me? The not knowing is almost worse than the incident itself. My mind conjures up all sorts of terrifying possibilities. Was it a thief who got cold feet? A stalker fixated on our family? Some sick person who got pleasure from terrorizing a child? I'll probably never know the truth. But that night changed me forever. It shattered my sense of safety and security in my own home. It stole my childhood innocence and carefree nature. Even now, I'm hyper-vigilant about home security. I have top-of-the-line alarm systems, security cameras, reinforced locks on every door and window. Some might call it paranoia, but they didn't experience what I did. I often wonder what would have happened if the intruder had tried to take me, if my parents had come home while they were still in the house. So many horrifying what-ifs that I can't bear to dwell on. All I know is that I'm incredibly lucky that nothing worse happened that night, but the psychological scars remain. The lingering fear and unease whenever I'm alone in a quiet house. The way my heart races at unexpected noises in the night. I've tried therapy over the years, but it's hard to process a trauma with so many unanswered questions. How do you move past something when you don't even know what really happened or why? Sometimes I think about trying to track down any similar incidents in my old neighborhood from that time, to see if I can find any clues or explanations. But part of me is afraid of what I might uncover. Maybe it's better not to know. All I can do is try to keep myself and my own family safe now, to be vigilant without letting fear control my life, and to be grateful that whatever the intruder's intentions were that night, they left without physically harming me. But I'll never forget those footsteps coming up the stairs, that raspy breathing above my bed, the sheer terror of lying there, eyes squeezed shut, as a stranger loomed over me in the dark. It's a nightmare I'll carry with me always, a stark reminder of how quickly our sense of safety can be shattered. I was only 10 years old when it happened, but the memories of that day are forever seared into my mind. It was the last day of 4th grade, and I was so excited for summer vacation to start. My best friend Dennis and I had big plans to ride our bikes, play video games, and just hang out all summer long. As the final bell rang, all the kids poured out of the school, laughing and shouting. I waved goodbye to my teacher and headed towards the parking lot where my mom usually picked me up. Dennis came running up to me, out of breath. "Hey, Tommy, my uncle is here to pick me up today. Want to come over and play some Nintendo?" Dennis asked excitedly. I hesitated for a moment. My mom always told me to wait for her and never go with anyone else. But this was Dennis's uncle, not a stranger. And I really wanted to try out the new Mario game Dennis had been bragging about. "Okay, sure," I replied. "Let me just call my mom real quick to let her know." I pulled out the little flip phone my parents had given me for emergencies and dialed home. No answer. I left a quick voicemail explaining where I was going, figuring my mom would get it soon. Dennis led me over to an old blue sedan idling at the curb. A man with graying hair and thick glasses sat in the driver's seat. He smiled and waved as we approached. "Hi there. You must be Tommy," the man said cheerfully. "Hop on in, boys. I've got snacks waiting at home." Something about his smile seemed off to me, but I pushed the uneasy feeling aside. This was Dennis's uncle after all. I climbed into the back seat next to Dennis, my backpack between my feet. As we pulled away from the school, I noticed the man kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes had a strange, hungry look that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being silly. "So, Dennis, how was the last day of school?" the man asked. Dennis looked confused. It was okay, I guess." That's great, the man replied absently, his eyes flicking to me again in the mirror. A knot of dread began to form in my stomach. Why didn't Dennis's uncle know his name? And why did he keep staring at me? I gripped the straps of my backpack tightly, trying to stay calm. We drove for what felt like hours, the houses and stores becoming more spread out. This definitely wasn't the way to Dennis's house. My heart started racing as panic set in. I needed to get out of this car. I think I should go home now," I said in a shaky voice. "My mom is probably worried." The man's eyes hardened as he looked at me in the mirror. "We're almost there, Tommy. Just a few more minutes." I looked over at Dennis, hoping he would back me up. To my horror, silent tears were streaming down his face as he stared out the window. This man wasn't his uncle. We were being kidnapped. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I try to open the door and jump out? We were going so fast I'd probably get hurt. Maybe I could grab the steering wheel, but then we might crash. My hand brushed against the lump of my cell phone in my pocket. Of course, I could call for help. Moving as slowly and casually as I could, I slipped the phone out and held it low by my leg. With trembling fingers, I managed to dial 911. Just as the call connected, the car suddenly swerved onto a bumpy dirt road. The man's eyes met mine in the mirror, wide with anger as he realized what I was doing. "Drop the phone, you little brat," he snarled, reaching back to grab at me. I ducked away from his grasping hand, clutching the phone to my ear. "Please help," I cried to the 911 operator. "We're being kidnapped. We're on a dirt road somewhere outside of—" The car screeched to a halt, throwing me forward. Before I could react, the man had wrenched open the back door and was dragging me out by my arm. I screamed and kicked, desperately hanging onto my phone. "Let go of me," I yelled as he pulled me towards a dilapidated old farmhouse. The peeling paint and boarded-up windows made it look like something out of a horror movie. "Shut up!" the man growled, twisting my arm painfully. "You've ruined everything, you stupid kid. Now I have to speed things up." I could hear the 911 operator's tinny voice still coming from my phone as the kidnapper yanked it out of my grasp and hurled it into the weeds. Terror clutched at my chest as he shoved me through the front door of the house. Would the police be able to find us out here? The interior of the house was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and piles of old junk. My captor dragged me down a hallway, Dennis trailing behind us with his head down. I tried to dig my heels in, but the man was too strong. We came to a heavy wooden door that the kidnapper wrenched open, revealing a set of stairs descending into blackness. A dank, moldy smell wafted up from below. My blood ran cold as I realized he was going to lock us in the basement. "No, please don't," I begged, renewing my struggles. "Let us go." The man ignored my pleas, shoving me roughly towards the stairs. I stumbled, nearly falling headfirst down into the darkness. Just then, a shrill siren cut through the air outside. My heart leapt. The police had found us. "Damn it," the kidnapper swore. He hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between dragging us down to the basement or making a run for it. Taking advantage of his distraction, I twisted out of his grip and bolted back down the hallway. I could hear him pounding after me, but adrenaline gave me speed. I burst out the front door just as several police cars came skidding into the yard, lights flashing. "Help! Help me!" I screamed, running towards the nearest officer with my arms outstretched. Everything happened in a blur after that. The kidnapper tried to flee but was quickly tackled and handcuffed. Dennis was led out of the house, pale and shaking. Police swarmed the property, taking photos and gathering evidence. An ambulance arrived to check us over for injuries. I sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of the ambulance, relief washing over me in waves. We were safe. It was over. I watched as the officers put the kidnapper in the back of a police car. His eyes met mine for a moment, filled with cold rage that made me shudder. My parents arrived not long after, having been contacted by the police. My mom burst into tears when she saw me, crushing me in a hug. "Oh, Tommy, I was so scared," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry I didn't answer your call earlier." As we drove home that evening, my dad explained what they had learned from the police. The kidnapper wasn't Dennis's uncle at all, but an associate of Dennis's father who owed money to some dangerous people. He had planned to hold us for ransom. If I hadn't managed to call 911, who knows what would have happened to us? That night, I lay awake in bed for hours, jumping at every little sound. Even though I knew the kidnapper was in jail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his angry face staring at me. The next few weeks were rough. I had terrible nightmares and was afraid to leave the house. My parents took me to a therapist, which helped some. Slowly, I started to feel safe again, though I knew I would never be as carefree as I was before. Dennis and his mom moved away that summer. I heard his dad got arrested too, though I'm not sure of the details. Sometimes I wonder how Dennis is doing and if he's okay. I hope he was able to get help and heal from the trauma too. It's been almost 20 years since that day, but I still think about it often. I'm eternally grateful to the 911 operator and police officers who saved us, and I'm proud of my 10-year-old self for having the presence of mind to make that call. I tell my own kids now to always trust their instincts if something doesn't feel right, and to never, ever go with a stranger, no matter what they say. You just never know what someone's true intentions might be. Logan had invited a small group of us over to ring in the new year. With the pandemic in full swing, we figured a low-key gathering was the safest bet. It was just me, Logan, and our buddy Cody. We'd known each other since high school and tried to get together whenever we could. Logan's place was this old Victorian-style house that had been in his family for generations. It always gave me a bit of an eerie vibe, but I chalked it up to its age and creaky floorboards. That night, though, something felt different. We were hanging out in the living room, drinking beers and watching the New Year's Eve countdown on TV. Everything seemed normal at first. We joked around, caught up on each other's lives, and made half-hearted resolutions we knew we wouldn't keep. As midnight approached, we cracked open a bottle of champagne Logan had been saving. The ball dropped. We toasted to 2021, hoping it would be better than the dumpster fire that was 2020. For a moment, everything felt good, normal, like maybe things were looking up. That feeling didn't last long. It was around 2 a.m. when things started getting weird. We were still up, a little buzzed, playing video games in the living room. That's when I first heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from somewhere in the house. At first I ignored it. Old houses make noise, right? But then it got louder, more persistent. I paused the game and asked, "Hey, you guys hear that?" Logan and Cody looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" Cody asked. I was about to explain when the sound came again, a slow, rhythmic creaking. This time, they heard it too. Logan's face went pale. That sounds like it's coming from the basement," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, listening. The creaking continued, steady and unnerving. It sounded like someone rocking in a chair, but that was impossible. We were the only ones in the house. "Should we check it out?" I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Part of me hoped they'd say no, that we'd just ignore it and go back to our game. But curiosity and a false sense of liquid courage from the alcohol pushed us forward. Logan nodded slowly, standing up. Yeah, we should see what's going on." We made our way to the basement door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The creaking got louder as we approached. Logan reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking slightly. He looked back at us, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The basement was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight coming through a small window. The creaking stopped as soon as the door opened. We stood at the top of the stairs, peering into the darkness below. "Logan, where's the light switch?" Cody whispered. Logan fumbled along the wall, finally finding it. With a click, the basement was illuminated, revealing a cluttered space filled with old furniture and boxes. And there, in the corner, was a rocking chair. It wasn't moving now, but we all knew that's where the sound had been coming from. That was my grandmother's," Logan said, his voice shaky. "She passed away a few years ago. We kept some of her things down here." We slowly made our way down the stairs, our eyes fixed on the chair. It looked ordinary enough, old, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings on the arms and back. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. As we got closer, I noticed the dust. Everything in the basement was covered in a thick layer of it, except the rocking chair. The seat looked clean, almost as if someone had just been sitting in it. "This is crazy," Cody muttered. "We all heard it moving, right? I'm not going crazy?" I nodded, unable to take my eyes off the chair. "Yeah, we all heard it." Logan stepped forward, reaching out to touch the chair. As soon as his fingers made contact, a cold breeze swept through the basement. The light flickered, and for a split second I swear I saw a figure sitting in the chair, an old woman, her face gaunt and eyes milky white. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. Did you guys see that?" Logan and Cody looked at me, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "See what?" Logan asked. Before I could answer, the chair started rocking violently. We all jumped back, watching in horror as it moved on its own, creaking loudly. It went on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. There was no way to explain it, no draft, no strings, nothing that could have made the chair move like that. We should go back upstairs," Logan finally said, his voice barely audible. None of us argued. We practically ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. Back in the living room, we all collapsed onto the couch, our minds racing. "What the hell just happened?" Cody asked, running his hands through his hair. Logan shook his head. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like that before." We spent the rest of the night talking in hushed tones, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. Maybe it was the alcohol playing tricks on us. Maybe there was some logical explanation we were missing. But deep down, we all knew what we saw was real. As the sun started to rise, casting an eerie glow through the windows, we finally decided to try and get some sleep. None of us wanted to be alone, so we crashed in the living room. I don't think any of us actually slept, though. Every creak of the house, every shadow had us on edge. The next morning we went back down to the basement, half expecting the chair to be gone or moved. But it was exactly where we'd left it, looking innocent in the daylight. Logan decided to get rid of it that day, donating it to a local thrift store. Part of me wanted to warn them, to tell them what had happened. But I knew how crazy it would sound. It's been over a year since that night, and I still can't shake the memory of what happened. Logan sold the house a few months later, saying he couldn't live there anymore. Cody refuses to talk about it, changing the subject whenever it comes up. As for me, I've become a bit of a believer in the supernatural. I find myself researching ghost stories, looking for experiences similar to ours. I've never found anything quite like it, though. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a rocking chair creaking, even though I know there isn't one in my apartment. I don't know what we encountered that New Year's Eve. Was it the spirit of Logan's grandmother, some other entity, or just a bizarre, unexplainable event? I may never know for sure, But one thing's certain, I'll never look at a rocking chair the same way again. I've never been so terrified in my life. It all started when I moved to a new city for grad school and needed to find affordable housing fast. I came across a listing for a room in a shared house that seemed perfect. Great location, reasonable rent, utilities included. The owner, Rob, seemed nice enough when I went to check it out. He was in his early 30s, worked in IT, and had lived there for a few years. We chatted for a bit, and he seemed totally normal. I was relieved to find such a good situation on short notice, so I signed the lease and moved in the following week. At first, everything was fine. Rob was friendly but gave me space. We'd occasionally chat in the kitchen or living room, but mostly kept to ourselves. After about 2 weeks, though, things started to get a little weird. Rob began asking me to hang out more often, grabbing dinner, going to movies, etc. I politely declined, saying I was busy with schoolwork. He seemed disappointed, but I didn't think much of it. Then one night I came home late after studying at the library. As I was heading to my room, Rob came out of his room and started talking to me, asking about my day and what I'd been up to. I was exhausted and just wanted to go to bed, but he kept the conversation going for nearly an hour. Every time I tried to excuse myself, he'd find another topic to bring up. It was getting really uncomfortable. A few days later, I decided to install a lock on my bedroom door. I hadn't felt unsafe exactly, but something about Rob's behavior was making me uneasy. When he saw me putting in the lock, he got visibly agitated. He demanded to know why I felt I needed a lock, insisting that he was trustworthy and I had nothing to worry about. His reaction only reinforced my decision to add the extra security. Things escalated quickly after that. Rob started accidentally walking in on me in the bathroom, even though I always kept the door locked. He'd linger outside my room, and I'd hear him pacing in the hallway late at night. I started spending as much time as possible out of the house, only coming home to sleep. One evening, as I was entering the house, a woman I'd never seen before approached me on the front steps. She looked nervous and asked if I lived there with Rob. When I said yes, her face fell. She told me she used to date Rob, and that he had multiple restraining orders against him from different women. She urged me to be careful and gave me her number in case I ever needed help. I was stunned and scared, unsure what to do with this information. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard my doorknob turning. My heart started racing. I watched in horror as the door slowly opened. Rob had somehow gotten past the lock. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. I was frozen in fear. After what felt like an eternity, he mumbled something about thinking he heard a noise and left. As soon as he was gone, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was shaking uncontrollably as I described what had happened. They said they'd send someone right away. I quickly threw some clothes and essentials in a bag, not wanting to still be there when the cops arrived in case it set Rob off. I snuck out of the house and ran down the street to wait for the police. When they got there, I told them everything. The increasing boundary violations, the warning from Rob's ex, and him entering my room. They took my statement and said they'd question Rob. I ended up staying with a classmate for a few days until I could find a new place to live. I never went back to that house. The police called to let me know they'd arrested Rob. Turns out he had an outstanding warrant in another state. I later found out he'd done similar things to other female roommates before. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about waking up to find Rob standing over my bed. I'm much more cautious about living situations now, and always trust my gut if something feels off. I'm just grateful I got out of there before anything worse happened. The whole experience left me deeply shaken and on edge. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, or if the police hadn't arrived when they did. It's terrifying to think how quickly a seemingly normal living situation can turn dangerous.